Hey guys, tonight we're slipping through a hidden door in a stone castle wall, stepping into a world where love was never simple, never free, and always dangerous. You're standing in a torchlit corridor where every glance carries weight, every whispered word could ruin a life, and the heart's desires must bow to rules written nowhere but understood by everyone. Tonight, you'll discover the secret codes that governed medieval royal romance, the unspoken laws that turned affection into a high-stakes game of strategy, symbolism and survival. Picture yourself in the year 1180 dressed in heavy velvet that rustles with each movement. You're walking through the great hall of a French chateau, and across the room, someone catches your eye. Your pulse quickens, but you don't smile. You don't wave. You certainly don't walk over. Because in the medieval royal world, love didn't work that way. Marriage was a contract signed by fathers and kings, designed to merge lands, end wars, or secure alliances. Love real, passionate, heart-pounding love had to exist in the margins, in the shadows, governed by rules so intricate they'd make modern dating apps look simple. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for, about why medieval literature obsesses over impossible romances and tragic lovers. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below, but make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, or what fascinates you most about medieval history. Maybe you're tucked in bed in Toronto, or perhaps you're listening while the rain falls in London. I'd love to know. Now, let's keep the lights as soft as possible, turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You're learning the first unwritten rule tonight, courtly love. That peculiar medieval invention existed entirely separate from marriage. Imagine being a young noblewoman, perhaps 15 or 16, married off to a duke 3 times your age whom you met once before the wedding. Your husband controls your property, your movements, your future children. But here's where medieval society performed its strangest trick. It acknowledged that marriage had nothing to do with romantic love, and actually created an elaborate system to accommodate the affections that marriage couldn't contain. The concept emerged in the royal courts of southern France, particularly in Aquitaine, where Eleanor, that Eleanor Duchess, then Queen of France, then Queen of England, presided over what historians call courts of love. These weren't actual legal proceedings, but rather salons where nobles debated romantic dilemmas like philosophers arguing ethics. Should a knight love a married woman? Absolutely, the courtly love tradition answered, as long as he did so with proper devotion, discretion, and without consummating the relationship. Well, theoretically without consummation. The reality was always messier than the poetry. You'd learn these rules not from books, but from watching, listening, absorbing the subtle lessons performed daily around you. A young squire observes how his lord gazes at the countess during feasts not directly, but in stolen glances when her husband looks away. A lady-in-waiting notices which knight receives a barely perceptible nod from the queen. These microsignals formed a language more complex than the Latin you'd study with tutors. The foundation of courtly love required that genuine romantic feeling could only exist outside marriage, where choice and free will played a role. Inside marriage, there was duty, obligation, the production of legitimate heirs. But courtly love that demanded that you elevate your beloved to an almost religious pedestal. You'd write poems comparing her eyes to stars, her voice to angel song. You'd perform brave deeds hoping she'd notice. You'd suffer dramatically and eloquently because, and this is crucial, the suffering itself proved the love's authenticity. Historians still argue whether courtly love represented a genuine shift toward recognizing women's autonomy or merely sublimated dangerous sexual energies into safer, performative channels? The truth probably contained elements of both. For noble women trapped in arranged marriages, the courtly love system offered a strange kind of power. Men who would command armies would kneel poetically before them, beg for a kind word, treasure a discarded ribbon like holy relic. The troubadours of Provence composed songs that spelled out the rules in verse. Andreas Capellanus, a 12th century chaplain, even wrote a manual called The Art of Courtly Love that reads like a bizarre instruction guide. Rule 12 stated, "A true lover does not desire to embrace in love anyone except his beloved." Rule 14, "The easy attainment of love makes it of little value. Difficulty of attainment makes it prized." In other words, the game required obstacles, required yearning, required that satisfaction remain forever just out of reach. You'd participate in this system whether you wanted to or not if you lived at court. The alternative was to be seen as crude, unrefined, perhaps even suspicious. A knight who didn't profess devotion to some noble lady might be questioned about his masculinity or his loyalty. A lady who didn't maintain a circle of admirers might be pitied or gossiped about. The system was simultaneously liberating and suffocating. It gave emotional lives legitimacy, but trapped those emotions in rigid performance. Here's something peculiar that most people don't realize: courtly love was actually considered ennobling, morally improving. The idea was that loving a virtuous, unattainable woman made a man better, braver in battle, more generous, more refined in manner. Your beloved became your inspiration for self-improvement, though she might barely speak to you. Modern cynics might call this emotional manipulation, but medieval folk saw it as spiritual elevation, not entirely different from how monks devoted themselves to the Virgin Mary. The Church had complicated feelings about all this. On one hand, clergy wrote some of the courtly love manuals and served as go-betweens in romantic intrigues. On the other hand, the whole system glorified extramarital emotional bonds, which theologians found theologically problematic. The solution: everyone quietly agreed to treat courtly love as a refined, artistic game rather than actual adultery, at least in theory. When things got physical, well, that's when the rules became much more dangerous and the consequences far more severe. And the jokes medieval people had senses of humour about this stuff. Troubadours would sing mock-serious songs about knights so lovesick they forgot to eat, or ladies so beautiful that looking at them caused actual physical pain. One famous poem describes a knight so devoted that he agreed to spend a night in bed beside his lady without touching her, a test of his self-control. Spoiler: these tests appeared frequently in the literature, and readers absolutely understood the sexual tension and absurdity involved. Think of it as medieval romantic comedy, where the punchline was always how ridiculous men became when smitten. The whole system created a parallel emotional universe within castle walls. You might eat breakfast beside your lawful spouse, exchange pleasantries about estate management and the children's education, then spend the afternoon sighing over someone else entirely, and everyone knew it, accepted it, even expected it. The key was maintaining the performance, keeping the fiction alive that nothing improper was happening. As long as outward propriety remained intact, the inner world of romantic devotion could flourish in its prescribed boundaries. Different regions developed slight variations on the rules. In Germany, the Minnesingers practiced their own version, often with more mystical, spiritual overtones. In England, the tradition blended with older Anglo-Saxon loyalty bonds, creating something slightly less French and flowery, a bit more about duty and honour intertwined with affection. In Italy, courtly love mixed with the emerging humanism to produce works like Dante's devotion to Beatrice, a woman he barely knew but elevated to cosmic significance in his poetry. You're standing in that torchlit corridor again, and now you understand why the nobleman across the hall doesn't approach the woman he's gazing at. He's following the code. He's demonstrating his worthiness through restraint, through visible suffering, through the perfect performance of devotion. Tomorrow, perhaps, he'll compose a poem. Next week, he might wear her colours at a tournament. In a month, if he's fortunate, she might let her fan drop near him so he can return it, allowing their fingers to brush for half a second, an electric moment that he'll treasure and agonise over for weeks. This was the foundation, the bedrock rule. Love and marriage were separate countries with different laws, and navigating between them required skills most people today couldn't imagine needing. The game had just begun, and you were learning to play it with your life, reputation, and heart all wagered on the table. You're sitting in your chamber as dawn light filters through narrow windows, and a servant girl you've known since childhood slips through the door with more than just breakfast. Hidden beneath the linen covering your morning bread, there's a folded piece of parchment sealed with wax that bears no identifying mark. Your heart hammers as you break the seal, because you know that this tiny square of pressed fibre and ink could elevate you to euphoria or destroy your entire world. Welcome to the secret art of medieval royal correspondence, where every love letter was a calculated risk and the postal system ran on loyalty, bribery, and nerves of steel. The challenge was simple yet terrifying. How do you communicate private feelings when privacy doesn't exist in medieval castles? You're never truly alone. Servants dress you, undress you, empty your chamber pots, sleep on pallets outside your door. Ladies in waiting attend noblewomen constantly. Guards stand at every entrance. Chapels have priests who report to bishops. Even the walls have ears, literally, because castle architecture often included listening passages for security purposes. Some paranoid nobles actually built spy holes into guest chambers, and everyone knew it. So you learned to write in ways that protected both sender and receiver. The first rule of secret correspondence was plausible deniability. You never sign your actual name. Instead, you'd adopt a poetic pseudonym known only to your beloved. You might be the Knight of the Silver Moon or the Lady of the Eastern Tower. These weren't just romantic flourishes, they were legal protection. If a letter was intercepted, you could theoretically claim it was fiction, poetry, someone else's composition entirely. The language itself became coded. A letter asking about someone's garden might really be inquiring about their availability for a secret meeting. References to the Old Oak or the Northern Gallery were specific locations. Mentions of saints' feast days indicated timing. You'd write, "I pray for St. Catherine's intercession on her feast," which anyone reading would think was normal medieval piety. But your beloved knew it meant, "Meet me on November 25th. The calendar of saints became a scheduling system, and religious devotion provided perfect cover. Here's a quirky detail that makes historians chuckle. Some nobles used their hunting birds as message carriers, attaching tiny capsules to the legs of falcons or hawks. It sounds romantic until you consider the practicality training a bird to fly to a specific person's window, hoping it doesn't get eaten by a larger predator, praying the capsule doesn't fall off mid-flight. Success rates were probably abysmal, but the few times it worked must have felt like genuine magic. Imagine standing at your window at twilight when a peregrine falcon lands on the sill with a love note. That's commitment to atmosphere. More commonly, you'd rely on trusted servants, and trusted was doing heavy lifting in that sentence. You needed someone loyal enough to risk punishment, maybe even execution if the letter's contents were treasonous or threatened a powerful person's honour. You'd cultivate these relationships over years, perhaps a maid whose family you'd helped, or a squire who owed you a debt, or a priest whose discretion was ensured by mutual secrets. Medieval courts ran on patronage and obligation, and you'd cash in those social debts when your heart demanded it. The physical act of smuggling letters required creativity. Women hid folded parchments in their elaborate headdresses, those towering hennins and veiled contraptions that were fashionable torture devices. The structural wiring inside provided perfect hiding spots. Men concealed notes in boot heels, sword pommels, even hollowed-out book covers. One particularly clever method involved writing on the inside of glove cuffs you'd wear the gloves. Remove them in your beloved's presence as etiquette demanded, and the message transferred with the garment. Historians still argue whether invisible ink existed in medieval times as it did in later centuries. Some manuscripts reference using lemon juice or milk that becomes visible when heated, but evidence is ambiguous. What's certain is that acrostic poems were popular compositions where the first letter of each line spelled out a hidden message. You could circulate these openly as literary exercises while embedding "I love Marguerite" vertically through the verses. Clever, though not exactly subtle if someone was looking for it. The timing of letter delivery mattered enormously. You couldn't just hand someone a love note during Sunday Mass, far too public. Too many witnesses. Instead, you'd engineer seemingly accidental encounters. Your servant would happen to bump into their servant at the market. You'd arrange to visit the castle chapel at the same hour, where a prayer book left on a specific pew would contain your folded message. The confessional booth became an inadvertent dead-drop location, though using it that way was probably blasphemous. Medieval people compartmentalized their religious guilt fairly effectively when romance was involved. The content of these letters followed conventions as rigid as the delivery methods. You'd begin with elaborate protestations of unworthiness. I, the most miserable of wretches, dare to address the brightest star in heaven's firmament. Then you detail your suffering in excruciating, poetic detail: sleepless nights, loss of appetite, melancholy so profound that even wine tasted bitter. You'd reference classical lovers Pyramus and Thisbe, Tristan and Isolde, Lancelot and Guinevere. You'd quote scripture, ironically using the sensual poetry of the Song of Solomon to describe decidedly non-marital yearning. But here's what made these letters genuinely dangerous. They were physical evidence. In a world where most legal disputes got settled through witness testimony and oath-taking, a written document held enormous evidentiary power. If your letter fell into hostile hands, it could be used to prove adultery, justify an annulment, trigger a blood feud, or even be presented as evidence of treason if you'd been unwise enough to discuss politics alongside passion. Smart correspondents burned letters after reading them, but the heart wants keepsakes, and many people took that risk. Women faced particular dangers here. A noblewoman's reputation was her currency, and a compromising letter could tank her value on the aristocratic marriage market. Shame her family, give her husband grounds to lock her away in a convent or worse. Some women developed an additional layer of protection by having their ladies-in-waiting pen the actual letters while they dictated. That way, handwriting analysis couldn't definitively prove authorship. Medieval people understood forensics better than we give them credit for. The receiving end had its own protocols. When you got a secret letter, you'd read it somewhere genuinely private, your chamber, with the door barred, or better yet, outside during a hunting expedition where no walls could hide eavesdroppers. You'd memorize anything crucial, because keeping the letter meant risk. Then came the agonizing decision: respond or stay silent. Every exchange escalated the danger and deepened the connection simultaneously. Some letters never reached their intended recipients. Jealous rivals intercepted them. Servants got cold feet and destroyed them. Castle guards conducting routine security checks discovered them. There are documented cases of letters found decades or even centuries later, stuffed into wall crevices or hidden under floorboards by people who panicked and never retrieved them. Imagine archaeologists discovering your most vulnerable, romantic confession 700 years after you wrote it. That's immortality of a particularly embarrassing sort. The whole system created a strange secondary economy. Skilled scribes who could write in elegant hands got hired to compose letters for nobles whose own penmanship was clumsy. These scribes became unwilling keepers of dangerous secrets, knowing that their knowledge made them simultaneously valuable and vulnerable. Some made small fortunes through discretion. Others ended up dead in ditches when someone decided they knew too much. The medieval world didn't have non-disclosure agreements. It had threats and bribes. And occasionally, the system produced moments of genuine beauty. Letters that survived show real tenderness, real longing, real human connection struggling to exist within impossible constraints. A knight writes to a lady that her voice haunts him, that he'd trade his lands and titles for one afternoon in her presence. A noblewoman tells her beloved that she sees his face in every shadow, hears his laugh in every bird song. These weren't just formulaic exercises, these were people trying desperately to touch each other across the barriers their world had erected. You fold the letter you've just finished reading, your morning bread forgotten and cold. The servant girl waits, eyes carefully averted, giving you the pretense of privacy while standing ready to smuggle your response back through the castle's hidden circulatory system of gossip, alliance, and carefully managed risk. You reach for your own quill, dip it in oak gall ink, and begin to the one whose name I dare not write. You're standing in the great hall during a feast, and a nobleman approaches with wine-flushed confidence, clearly emboldened by drink and the festive atmosphere. He reaches for your hand, presumably to kiss it in courtly fashion, but his grip lingers too long. His eyes carry an invitation that crosses the line from admiration to presumption. And here's where medieval society reveals one of its most surprising contradictions, despite living in a world that treated women as property in marriage contracts. Noble women possessed a specific sacred power in the courtly love game, the absolute right to refuse, reject, and rebuke. This wasn't just accepted, it was central to the entire system. The lady's power of refusal was the cornerstone that made courtly love theoretically different from simple harassment or adultery. Without her ability to say no and to have that refusal respected, the whole elaborate game collapsed into something far darker and more coercive. So medieval culture, in its strange, contradictory way, granted women operating within this system a type of authority they often lacked elsewhere in their lives. You could refuse a suitor's advances, dismiss his poetry as inadequate, ignore his tournament victories, and society would not only accept this, but actually celebrate it as proof of your virtue and his devotion. The refusal itself followed unwritten rules as complex as any other aspect of courtly interaction. You couldn't be too direct, that would be unladylike, crude, a violation of the refined atmosphere everyone was pretending to maintain. But you couldn't be too subtle either, or the suitor might mistake politeness for encouragement and escalate his attentions into genuinely dangerous territory. The perfect refusal walked a precise line clear enough to be unmistakable, gentle enough to preserve everyone's dignity, and public enough that witnesses could confirm you'd maintained proper standards. Common refusal techniques included the redirected compliment. When a knight proclaimed his undying devotion, you'd respond with something like, "Your words honour me, though surely such eloquence deserves a worthier subject." Perhaps the Countess of Valois might better appreciate such refined sentiment. Translation: I'm not interested. Go bother someone else. But phrased so carefully that no one could accuse you of rudeness. You just suggested he was too good for you while simultaneously directing him toward another woman, a masterclass in diplomatic rejection. Another method was the spiritual deflection. You'd claim that your heart belonged entirely to religious devotion, that you'd privately vowed yourself to contemplation of divine love, and that earthly romance would distract from your spiritual duties. This was particularly effective because it was unassailable who could argue against religious piety. Some women actually did take such vows seriously, but others used it as the medieval equivalent of "I'm focusing on myself right now." The medieval world respected religious excuses, even when everyone suspected they were convenient fictions. Here's something modern people find shocking. A noblewoman's consistent refusal actually increased her status at court. The harder you were to win, the more valuable you became in the social marketplace of courtly love. Knights wanted the challenge, the story, the bragging rights of eventually earning favour from the most discriminating lady. If you accepted advances too easily, you'd be dismissed as lacking refinement or, worse, suspected of actual impropriety. But if you maintained high standards, refused most suitors, granted only the smallest favours after elaborate courtship, you'd become legendary. Historians still argue whether this system genuinely empowered women or simply created a more elaborate cage. The cynical view suggests that giving women power to refuse romantic advances while denying them control over marriages, property, or political decisions was a clever pressure valve. Let them feel powerful in this limited sphere so they don't rebel against the broader oppression. The optimistic interpretation holds that any space where women exercised autonomous choice, however constrained, represented genuine progress in societies that otherwise treated them as pawns and property. The reality probably contained both truths simultaneously. You'd experience this contradiction viscerally if you lived it. Your father could marry you off to a stranger for political advantage, and you'd have zero legal recourse. But if that same stranger then tried to court you romantically within the courtly love system, you could reject him utterly, and society would defend your right to do so. The dissonance must have been psychologically wild, powerless and powerful, oppressed and elevated, all at once. The most famous refuser in medieval literature was the lady in troubadour poetry who never, ever granted full satisfaction. She'd offer tiny encouragements, a smile, a handkerchief, permission to wear her colours, but always withheld ultimate acceptance. This wasn't just narrative structure, it reflected real practice. Noble women understood that the moment you fully accepted a suitor, the dynamic shifted. The chase ended, his devotion might cool, and you'd lose your leverage. Perpetual slight encouragement combined with perpetual ultimate refusal kept admirers engaged indefinitely. Some women wielded refusal as political strategy. Eleanor of Aquitaine, that same fascinating queen we mentioned earlier, was notorious for maintaining courts where she and her ladies would judge suitors' worthiness. A knight might spend months crafting poems, performing deeds, making elaborate displays, only to be told he hadn't yet proven himself adequately. These weren't just romantic games, they were power exercises. By controlling access to romantic favour, noble women created obligations, built alliances, and manipulated court dynamics in ways that formal political channels denied them. The church, predictably, had opinions about all this. Clergy generally approved of women refusing improper advances that aligned with teachings about chastity and virtue. But they worried when refusal became a game, when women seemed to enjoy the power too much. when the whole dynamic started resembling pride and vanity rather than righteous rejection of sin, sermons occasionally reminded noble women that excessive cruelty towards sincere suitors was itself a form of sin. The ideal Christian noblewoman was supposed to refuse gently, redirect kindly, never take pleasure in causing suffering. Good luck with that in actual practice. And here's a quirky detail that reveals how seriously people took this. Some courts developed formal rituals for refusal. A lady might return a gift unopened, which everyone understood as categorical rejection, or she'd accept a gift but display it in a specific way that signalled polite acknowledgement without encouragement. The placement of a ribbon, the way you wore a given jewel, whether you carried a book of poems in public view, all these tiny details communicated volumes to those fluent in the language. Men were expected to accept refusal gracefully, at least outwardly. Sulking was permitted, actually. Elaborate melancholic suffering was encouraged as proof of genuine feeling. But aggression, force, or public scenes were decidedly not acceptable. A knight who couldn't handle rejection with dignity lost status rapidly. Other men would mock him, women would avoid him, and he'd find himself socially sidelined. The system required that men treat women's refusal as final and worthy of respect. Even if that same system hypocritically gave fathers and husbands absolute authority over women's lives in other contexts. The refusal dynamic created some genuinely amusing situations. Imagine a knight who'd spent months courting a lady, writing poetry, winning tournaments in her honour, only to have her refuse him and then immediately start showing interest in his best friend. The emotional chaos, the wounded pride, the inevitable drama. Medieval courts thrived on this interpersonal theatre. It was entertainment in an era before television, the reality show content of its day, and everyone watched avidly to see who'd refuse whom next. But refusal carried risks, too. A woman who refused too many suitors might be labelled impossible, prideful, or suspiciously particular. Whispers might start what's wrong with her that she accepts no one. Is she hiding something? Does she have a secret lover already? The social pressure to maintain a circle of admirers while refusing them all required extraordinary social skill. You had to keep men interested enough to keep pursuing, but refused enough to maintain your elevated status. It was exhausting. Some women outsourced the refusal to allies. A lady-in-waiting might intercept would-be suitors before they reached her mistress, delivering gentle rejections on her behalf. My lady is indisposed. My lady is deep in prayer. My lady asks that you demonstrate your devotion through patience. These intermediaries became crucial buffers, handling the awkward emotional labour so noble women could maintain their untouchable mystique without directly crushing hopeful hearts dozens of times per week. The system even developed gradations of refusal. A complete, permanent no was rare and devastating. More common were provisional refusals, not yet. Prove yourself further. Perhaps when circumstances change. These kept suitors in orbit without committing to anything. Some men spent years in this liminal state, neither fully rejected nor accepted, sustained by scraps of hope and occasional tiny encouragements. Whether this was cruel or simply realistic depended largely on perspective and who was telling the story. You're back in that great hall, and the two-forward nobleman still holds your hand. You meet his eyes steadily, your voice carrying clearly enough for nearby courtiers to hear, "Sir Knight, your regard honours me beyond my deserving. I fear my poor heart is too occupied with devotion to Scripture and service to my lady the Queen to offer the response such eloquence merits." You gently extract your hand, offer a slight smile that manages to be both warm and absolutely final, and turn to engage the person beside you in conversation. The rejected suitor steps back, and though you don't look, you know he's bowing, accepting the refusal, already beginning to perform the wounded nobility that the code demands. Another man handled, another boundary maintained, another small victory in the endless, exhausting game of courtly love. You're in the crowded stands surrounding a tournament field, the air thick with dust and excitement and the metallic scent of armour being tested against armour. Horses thunder past in explosive bursts of colour and violence. Lances splinter with cracks that echo off castle walls. And somewhere in that organised chaos, a knight rides wearing a specific shade of blue silk tied around his arm. Your blue silk, your favour, your token that transforms him from anonymous warrior into your champion. This is perhaps the most public declaration in the courtly love playbook, and every single person watching understands exactly what it means. The tournament favour was never just a good luck charm. It was a statement, a claim, a piece of political theatre performed before hundreds of witnesses. When a knight requested your favour, a ribbon, a sleeve, a veil, sometimes even a more intimate item like a glove or a garter, he was asking permission to publicly associate himself with you. And when you granted it, you were announcing to everyone present that this man had achieved some level of standing in your regard. The crowd would notice. They'd gossip about it for weeks. Your husband would definitely notice, and his reaction depended on countless variables you'd have calculated before ever handing over that scrap of silk. The request itself followed protocols as formal as any diplomatic negotiation. A knight didn't just approach you and demand a token, like he was asking for fries with his order. He'd send an intermediary, usually a squire or trusted servant, who'd make the request on his behalf with elaborate courtesy. My lord wishes to know if my lady would grant him the honour of bearing her favour in tomorrow's joust, that he might strive more valiantly, knowing he carries a token of the most gracious lady in Christendom. Flowery language wasn't optional. It was armour against accusations of impropriety. Your response required equal calculation. Granting your favour to a powerful knight who'd likely win brought reflected glory. Everyone would talk about how your token inspired his victory. But favour the wrong competitor, especially one who then got humiliated in the lists, and you'd share in that embarrassment. Some ladies developed reputations as lucky. Their favours seemed to correlate with victories, which was probably more about skilled knights requesting favours from high-status ladies than actual supernatural influence. But medieval people loved their superstitions. Here's the mainstream historical fact everyone knows: tournaments were incredibly dangerous. These weren't gentle Renaissance fair reenactments with choreographed outcomes and safety protocols. Real knights with real weapons, sometimes blunted, sometimes not, collided at speeds that regularly produced broken bones, concussions, and occasional deaths. Wearing someone's favour meant you were willing to risk actual injury or death while publicly associated with them. That raised the stakes considerably beyond mere romantic gesture into something approaching blood oath. But here's a quirky detail: most people don't know the specific placement of the favour on a knight's body carried meaning. Tied around the upper arm suggested respectful admiration and the early stages of courtship. Worn closer to the heart indicated deeper feeling. A favour attached to a helmet was bold, intimate, suggesting the lady's thoughts literally crowning the knight's mind. Ladies and knights both understood this geography of devotion, and choosing the wrong placement could send messages you didn't intend. The favour itself was supposed to be something personal, something that had touched your body and therefore carried your essence. This sounds romantic until you remember medieval hygiene standards and realise that a sweat-dampened veil or a well-worn sleeve wasn't exactly fresh. But that was part of the magic the item carried: your scent, your physical presence, creating a tangible connection between your body and the knight's performance. Medieval people were far less squeamish about bodily reality than we tend to be. Historians still argue whether the favour system increased or decreased the actual danger of tournaments. One theory suggests that knights fought more recklessly when wearing a lady's token, driven by desire to impress and terror of disappointing her. Another view holds that the favour actually encouraged more skillful, controlled fighting because a dead knight couldn't continue courting his lady, and most knights preferred surviving to dying gloriously. Probably both impulses existed in different men at different moments. The crowd's reaction to favour-wearing knights was part of the spectacle. When you granted your token, other ladies in the stands would lean over to comment, approve, or more entertainingly express scepticism. Do you really think Sir Robert has a chance against the champion? I heard he's already wearing Lady Eleanor's ribbon under his armour. That's the third favour he's worn this season. How fickle. The stands buzzed with the gossip and judgment, and you'd sit there knowing every eye occasionally flickered toward you, assessing, evaluating, gossiping. Your husband's presence complicated everything exponentially. If he sat beside you while another man wore your favour in the lists, the air would crackle with unspoken tension. Some husbands treated it as expected courtly behaviour, even took pride that other men found their wives worthy of admiration. It reflected well on their own status and taste in selecting a bride. Other husbands seethed quietly, maintaining public composure while mentally cataloguing grievances to address later in private. Reading which type of husband you had was essential survival skill. Smart noblewomen sometimes granted favours strategically to diffuse potential problems. If your husband seemed jealous of a particular knight's attention, you might conspicuously grant your favour to an elderly, completely unthreatening knight, or even to a very young squire, demonstrating that the gesture was charitable rather than romantic. Or you'd favour your husband's political ally, turning the romantic gesture into a diplomatic statement that supported rather than threatened your marriage's political utility. The knight's performance while wearing your favour became a referendum on your judgment. If he won spectacularly, you'd receive congratulations as if you'd somehow contributed to his victory. Ladies would ask for your insights on horsemanship or combat, as if granting a ribbon made you a tactical expert. If he lost badly, you'd face sympathetic looks tinged with pity and perhaps a bit of schadenfreude. And if he got seriously injured or killed, the emotional burden was intense. You'd be expected to display appropriate distress without crossing into the excessive grief that might suggest the relationship was more than courtly admiration. Some knights collected favours like trophies, wearing multiple ribbons from different ladies, turning themselves into mobile advertisements for their own popularity. This was generally considered tacky and somewhat desperate, but ambitious knights trying to build their reputations sometimes did it anyway. The truly elite knights were selective, wearing only one or two favours from the most prestigious ladies, understanding that quality mattered more than quantity in the courtly status game. And here's where things got deliciously complicated. Tournaments attracted knights from multiple kingdoms and regions, creating situations where your favour-wearing champion might be fighting against your husband's allies or even family members. The political calculations became three-dimensional chess. You'd be cheering for the knight wearing your token while hoping he didn't too thoroughly humiliate the knight your husband supported, trying to project enthusiasm of both sides simultaneously, your face a careful mask of diplomatic appreciation for martial skill in general rather than specific victory. The favour sometimes got returned after the tournament in elaborate ceremonies. The knight would approach, often still in armour, covered in dust and possibly blood, and offer back your ribbon with pretty speeches about how it inspired him to glory, how he was unworthy of such a precious talisman, how he hoped his performance demonstrated his devotion, You'd accept it graciously, maybe even scandalously agree to let him keep it as recognition of his achievement. That favour, now battle-marked and famous, would become a relic of sorts, something he might treasure for years or even be buried with. Other times, the favour got lost in the chaos of combat, torn away by an opponent's lance, trampled into mud by war horses, simply disappeared in the fast. In the violence, this created awkward moments. Was the loss symbolic? Did it suggest the knight's devotion was as careless as his equipment management? Or was it proof of how fiercely he'd fought? Interpretation depended on who was doing the interpreting and what agenda they brought to the analysis. The entire favour system created a public dimension to courtly love that made the private aspects more dangerous. Once you'd publicly granted your favour, everyone knew you and that knight shared some connection, however theoretically innocent. Any subsequent private interactions would be viewed through the lens of that public association. If you were seen talking quietly with your favour-wearing champion at a feast, eyebrows would rise. If letters got discovered, the favour would be cited as evidence of ongoing relationship. You'd weaponised your own romance by making it visible, but for all the complications and calculations, there was something genuinely thrilling about watching a knight ride into combat wearing your colours. That primal satisfaction of having a warrior publicly declare himself your champion, of knowing that his strength and courage were being directed, at least symbolically, toward your honour. Medieval women rarely got to exercise power openly, but in the tournament stands, granting or withholding your favour, you held a small piece of genuine authority. The crowd might be watching the knights, but the knights were watching you. You're seated in the stands again as the herald announces the next joust, and you see him, the knight who'd sent his squire to request your favour yesterday. He's cantering his destrier around the perimeter of the lists, and there, tied around his right arm, is the blue silk ribbon you'd carefully selected and perfumed with lavender before handing it over. He raises his lance toward you in salute, and you incline your head precisely the correct amount, not too much enthusiasm, not too little acknowledgement. The crowd around you hums with interest. Your husband shifts almost imperceptibly beside you. The knight lowers his lance, spurs his horse forward, and charges toward whatever glory or disaster this afternoon holds, carrying a piece of you into battle. You're standing at the edge of a great hall where musicians have just begun playing a pavan, that slow, stately dance that moves like honey pouring from a jar. Your heart beats faster because you know what's coming, the intricate ballet of courtly dancing where every step, every turn, every moment of held hands becomes a conversation more intimate than words could ever be. Medieval dances weren't entertainment. They were negotiations, declarations, seductions performed in plain sight of everyone who mattered. The dance floor was a chessboard where romance and politics merged into something between art and warfare, and you'd better know the rules before stepping onto it. The request for a dance was itself a minefield of etiquette. A knight couldn't simply walk up and demand your hand well. He could, but everyone would judge him as crude and probably low-born. The proper approach required intermediaries, timing, and reading the room's social dynamics. He'd wait until you'd finished speaking with someone else. Approach from your left, never directly from behind. Startling a lady was unforgivable. Bow with precisely the correct depth for his rank relative to yours, and phrase his request as a question that sounded like poetry. My lady, would you honour this unworthy knight with your grace in the next dance? Your acceptance or refusal carried enormous weight. If you'd been obviously avoiding a particular suitor all evening and then accepted his invitation to dance, every gossip in the hall would notice and start speculating about what had changed. If you refused a high-ranking noble in favour of a lower-status knight, You'd created a public insult that might require your husband or father to smooth over diplomatically later. Dance partners were political statements, and everyone was watching to decode what you were signalling. The actual dancing positioned bodies closer than almost any other public interaction medieval society permitted. During a volta, that Renaissance dance where the man actually lifts his partner, his hands would grip your waist. Your hand would rest on his shoulder. Your faces would come within inches of each other. The physical contact, even through layers of heavy fabric, was electric precisely because it was so rare and regulated. You'd spend all day maintaining proper distance from men, and then during a dance, suddenly there were hands on your body, your breath mingling with his, your eyes meeting at close range. Here's the mainstream fact: medieval dances followed extremely complex patterns that took years to master. The Bass dance, the Saltarello, the Allemande each had specific steps, rhythms, and formations that changed regionally and evolved over time. Messing up the steps wasn't just embarrassing, it revealed your education level and social sophistication. Nobles who couldn't dance well faced quiet mockery and found fewer romantic opportunities. Dancing skill was as important as literacy for maintaining status. But here's a quirky detail most people miss. Hand placement during partner dances had rules so specific they'd make modern etiquette books look casual. When a man took a woman's hand for a dance, he was supposed to grasp only her fingers, never her palm, and only with his fingertips, never his full hand. Too firm a grip suggested aggressive possessiveness. Too gentle suggested either weakness or that he found her distasteful. The perfect pressure confident but respectful communicated volumes. Ladies would literally practice with their maids to perfect the feel of their hand in a partner's grasp. Eye contact during dances was its own language. Looking directly at your partner's eyes was bold, intimate, suggesting interest that went beyond mere social obligation. Looking past his shoulder while dancing indicated polite tolerance but no particular enthusiasm. Glancing at his eyes and then quickly away suggested shyness or internal conflict. You wanted to look, but propriety held you back. Dancers who understood this language could have entire conversations without speaking a word, their eyes asking questions and providing answers while their feet executed formal patterns. The dance floor's geography mattered enormously. Dances that moved couples around the room in prescribed patterns meant you'd spend most of the dance visible to everyone, performing your interaction for the audience. But certain formations, particularly circle dances where couples briefly separated from the main group, created momentary pockets of relative privacy where quick whispered exchanges could happen. "Meet me in the garden after Vespers." "I received your letter. My husband suspects." 10 words spoken during a turn. Then you'd return to the larger formation, faces carefully neutral. Historians still argue whether the elaborate hand-holding in medieval dances was designed to provide acceptable intimate contact or to strictly regulate and minimize it. Some scholars suggest that by channeling physical interaction into these formal, public, rule-bound contexts, medieval society was actually preventing more dangerous private touching. Others argue that the dances provided one of the few spaces where men and women could experience physical connection. And that's precisely why the rules were so elaborate to contain something powerful and potentially disruptive. The music itself sent signals. Slow dances like the pavan allowed for conversation, for sustained eye contact, for the prolonged intimacy of matched movement. Fast dances like the galliard required athletic ability and provided opportunities to show off physical prowess. Men would execute elaborate leaps and kicks. Women would showcase grace under speed. Choosing which dance to request was choosing which qualities you wanted to display, or which mood you wanted to create. Some dance formations deliberately separated partners. You'd hold hands with your beloved, then the pattern would send you turning with other partners in sequence, then reunite you. This created built-in longing you'd touch briefly, separate, dance with others while watching your desired partner across the circle doing the same, then come together again. The interruption made the reunion sweeter, and medieval choreographers understood this psychology perfectly. They were basically inventing the slow-burn romantic tension that modern media still uses. Women wielded particular power on the dance floor through their ability to accept or refuse requests, but also through their skill level. A woman who danced beautifully became more sought after, her favour more valuable, her social status elevated. Ladies would practice for hours to perfect their technique, knowing that grace in movement translated directly into romantic and social currency. Some kept dancing masters on retainer the way modern celebrities hire personal trainers, understanding that physical excellence was investment in future prospects. Men faced different pressures. A knight who was formidable in battle but clumsy in dance faced mockery that could undermine his entire reputation. The courtly ideal demanded excellence in all refined arts, not just martial prowess. Some warriors genuinely struggled with this. Men whose bodies knew how to fight found the precise, controlled movements of formal dance frustrating, but refusing to participate was social suicide, so they'd grimace through it, counting steps like battle plans, sweating more from social anxiety than physical effort. The end of a dance created another crucial moment. As the music concluded, partners would separate, bow and curtsy to each other, exchange final eye contact. This was the moment to invite continuation. Perhaps my lady would honour me again in the next dance, or to gracefully end the interaction, "Thank you for your grace, Sir Knight." How you parted signalled whether this was beginning of something or merely a single, isolated interaction. And everyone watching would note who lingered, who hurried away, who immediately sought another partner, versus who stood watching their recent partner from across the room. Dance cards or lists, when they existed in later medieval periods, became strategic documents. You'd plan your evening, deciding who to dance with and in what order, balancing obligations to family allies with desires to engage with romantic interests. Dancing with your husband once or twice was expected, and politically wise. It showed unity and propriety. But dancing with him exclusively would be seen as either excessive devotion or suspicious protectiveness, both of which invited speculation. The physical exhaustion of medieval dancing is something modern people underestimate. These weren't 3-minute pop songs. Dances could continue for 20 minutes or longer, performed in heavy formal clothing, often in crowded, overheated halls. The physical intimacy of having someone guide your tired body through complex patterns, supporting you when you stumbled, adjusting their pace to match your faltering energy, these moments of genuine human vulnerability within formal structure created bonds that the rules simultaneously enabled and constrained. Here's something that reveals medieval people's sense of humour. Comic dances existed where the rules were deliberately broken for entertainment. A fool might perform an exaggerated courtship dance, mimicking noble behaviour so precisely that everyone laughed at recognition of their own absurdity. Or couples would perform peasant dances that featured closer contact and wilder movements, allowing aristocrats to briefly pretend they lived under different rules while still maintaining the fiction that such behaviour was beneath them, performed ironically. Of course, not sincerely. The politics of refusing dance requests could get vicious. If a powerful nobleman requested a dance and you refused, you'd better have an ironclad excuse: sudden illness, a previous promise to another partner, religious obligation. A flimsy refusal could create lasting enmity. Some women developed elaborate excuse systems, maintaining lists of prior commitments they could reference, cultivating reputations for particular piety that made religious excuses more believable, even faking minor injuries that conveniently prevented dancing with undesired partners while mysteriously healing in time for preferred ones. You're on the dance floor now, your hand resting lightly in your partner's fingertips, your body's moving through the prescribed patterns of a bass dance. You're acutely aware of every point of contact, his hand at your waist during a turn, your shoulders nearly touching during a promenade, the warmth of his breath when the formation brings your faces close. The music swells, you execute a perfect turn, your eyes meet his for exactly 3 heartbeats before propriety demands you look away. Around you, dozens of other couples perform the same elaborate ritual, but in this moment, the room contains only the 2 of you and the conversation your bodies are conducting in a language older than words. The dance continues, and so does the negotiation of what might happen after the music stops. You're kneeling in the castle chapel for morning prayers, the stone floor cold beneath your knees, incense smoke curling through shafts of coloured light from stained glass windows. The priest drones Latin verses you've heard 10,000 times. And just as you're about to drift into that meditative space where devotion meets boredom, a shadow falls across your prayer book. Someone has knelt beside you close enough that you feel the warmth radiating from their body. Close enough that when they shift position, fabric brushes against fabric. You don't look up. You don't need to. The scent of particular soap, the distinctive rhythm of breathing, tells you exactly who's arrived, and you know this encounter is no accident. Welcome to the world of chaplains, confessors, and go-betweens, the unlikely matchmakers and message carriers who made medieval royal romance actually function. Medieval castles were basically villages contained within walls. Hundreds of people living in proximity that made genuine privacy nearly impossible. But this crowdedness created opportunities as much as obstacles. In the constant circulation of servants, clergy, guards, and hangers-on, certain individuals became essential facilitators of romantic communication. These go-betweens operated in the shadows of official court life, trafficking in secrets, arranging encounters, delivering messages that could never be sent through formal channels. They were part diplomat, part spy, part therapist, and entirely essential. Chaplains and confessors occupied uniquely powerful positions in this ecosystem. As clergy, they had access to nearly everyone and every space in the castle. They heard confessions, administered last rites, blessed meals, conducted masses. They moved between the public and private worlds, freely entering noble chambers for prayer, accessing women's quarters without suspicion, speaking privately with knights and ladies alike. This mobility made them perfect intermediaries for romantic intrigue, and many clergy understood this role perfectly well, performing it with varying degrees of enthusiasm, resignation, or entrepreneurial profit-seeking. The confessional booth was theoretically a sacred space where sins were admitted to God through his earthly representative. But medieval people were practical about sacred spaces. A clever noblewoman might confess her romantic entanglement to a sympathetic priest, who would then offer spiritual counsel that somehow included specific advice about when and where a particular person might be found alone. My daughter, you must pray for strength to resist temptation. Perhaps contemplation in the rose garden tomorrow after none, when the guards change and few others are about, would provide the solitude necessary for proper reflection. The priest's face would remain perfectly serious. The woman would murmur grateful acknowledgement, and both would understand the message beneath the message. Here's the mainstream historical fact the medieval church maintained complex, often contradictory attitudes toward romantic love. Official doctrine preached that marriage was a sacrament and that extramarital affections, even unconsummated ones, were spiritually dangerous. But actual clergy, living in the messy reality of aristocratic households, often participated in the courtly love system they were technically supposed to condemn. Some wrote love poetry themselves, some facilitated aristocratic liaisons, and many quietly accepted that the ideal and the real existed in separate spheres. But here's a quirky detail that reveals medieval ingenuity. Some clergy developed elaborate theological justifications for facilitating courtly love. They'd argue that helping nobles navigate romantic feelings in spiritually appropriate ways was actually pastoral care, keeping souls from worse sins by channeling dangerous passions into the relatively contained rituals of courtly devotion. It was twisted logic, but medieval theology specialized in making contradictions seem coherent. A priest could facilitate your love affair while genuinely believing he was protecting your soul from damnation. The mental gymnastics were impressive. Ladies-in-waiting served equally crucial roles as romantic intermediaries. These weren't servants in the modern sense, but rather noble women of slightly lower status who attended higher-ranking ladies, living in intimate proximity, privy to every secret, every mood, every whispered confession. A competent lady-in-waiting became her mistress's co-conspirator, carrying messages, creating alibis, running interference with suspicious husbands, and generally enabling the courtly love game to function. The relationship required absolute trust because these women knew everything and could destroy you with a single well-placed revelation. The trust-building process between a noble woman and her ladies-in-waiting often began in childhood. Girls from allied families would be sent to serve in great households, forming bonds over years of shared experience. By the time romantic intrigue became relevant, these women knew each other's secrets, fears, and desires better than sisters. This intimacy made them perfect go-betweens. They could anticipate their mistress's needs, interpret subtle signals, and act with initiative when direct orders couldn't be given. A meaningful glance across a crowded room might be all the instruction required. Male servants and squires performed similar functions for knights and noblemen. A squire who'd served his lord for years understood not just his combat preferences, but his romantic entanglements. These young men would carry messages, arrange meetings, stand watch during clandestine encounters, and generally facilitate their lords' courtly pursuits. For ambitious squires, demonstrating discretion and effectiveness in these matters could be career-defining lords, rewarded loyalty and competence in romantic facilitation as generously as they rewarded it in military service. Historians still argue whether these go-betweens were exploited pawns or wielded significant power themselves. The pessimistic view suggests they were coerced into complicity, threatened with dismissal or worse if they refused to facilitate their master's romantic adventures. The more optimistic interpretation holds that skilled intermediaries recognized their value and negotiated rewards, gifts, favors, promises of future support. Probably both dynamics existed simultaneously, varying by individual circumstances and the personalities involved. The communication systems these go-betweens operated were remarkably sophisticated. A lady-in-waiting might drop a specific handkerchief in a corridor, signalling to a watching squire that his lord should proceed to a prearranged location. A chaplain might cough meaningfully during prayers to indicate that a letter had been delivered successfully. Servants would exchange glances across crowded halls, confirming arrangements without speaking a word. These people developed their own subtle language of signals and signs that operated beneath the awareness of those not initiated into the conspiracy. The risk for go-betweens was substantial and often exceeded the risks faced by the actual lovers. If an affair was discovered and became scandalous, the principles might face social consequences, but they had status, family connections, and resources to weather storms. A servant or minor cleric caught facilitating forbidden romance might face immediate dismissal, physical punishment, or worse. They gambled their livelihoods on the discretion and gratitude of aristocrats who might abandon them instantly if protecting them became inconvenient. Despite this, many continued participating because the rewards, both material and social, made the risks worthwhile. Some go-betweens became legendary for their skill and discretion. Medieval literature references famous servants whose names were synonymous with successful romantic facilitation. These individuals built reputations that preceded them, becoming sought after by multiple nobles, moving between households, essentially professionalizing the role of romantic intermediary. They were the medieval equivalent of high-end matchmakers or discreet fixers, and they commanded impressive compensation for their services. The emotional labour involved in being a go-between is something modern people might underestimate. These intermediaries weren't just carrying messages, they were managing the emotional chaos of people engaged in high-stakes romantic relationships. A lady-in-waiting would comfort her weeping mistress after a lover's rejection, then turn around and diplomatically communicate that rejection to the lover without triggering a destructive emotional response. A squire would counsel his lovesick lord on appropriate next moves, essentially providing relationship advice while maintaining the fiction that he was just following orders. These people were part-time therapists without any formal training in psychology. The confessional created particularly complex ethical territory. A priest hearing confession from both parties in a romantic entanglement faced theological nightmares about confidentiality and spiritual counsel. If a wife confessed adultery and her lover separately confessed the same sin, the priest theoretically couldn't reveal either confession or even acknowledge knowing about the relationship. But he could offer general guidance to both that might include advice about ending the affair, being more discreet, or accepting the spiritual consequences. The seal of confession became simultaneously a protection and a prison for clergy, caught between duty to God and reality of aristocratic households. Women go-betweens faced unique challenges around their own reputations. A lady-in-waiting who facilitated her mistress's romantic correspondence might be suspected of conducting her own affairs. The proximity to romantic intrigue could taint by association. Smart women managed this by cultivating reputations for either extreme piety or motherly older status, positioning themselves as either too holy or too old to be personally participating in romance, thereby deflecting suspicion while still facilitating everyone else's adventures. Here's something that reveals both medieval humour and humanity. Go-betweens occasionally fell in love with each other while facilitating their employers' romances. A squire carrying messages to a lady-in-waiting might begin lingering to talk, discovering common ground, eventually conducting their own courtship in the margins of their employer's drama. These secondary romances were sometimes more successful than the primary ones they were facilitating, precisely because servants faced fewer political constraints in choosing partners. The irony wasn't lost on anyone involved. The payment structure for go-between services varied wildly. Some servants considered it part of regular duties and expected no extra compensation. Others negotiated specific rewards for specific services, a coin for delivering a letter, more substantial gifts for arranging actual meetings, ongoing stipends for continued discretion. The most sophisticated operators maintained what amounted to tiered service levels, offering basic message delivery at one price and comprehensive romantic logistics management at premium rates. Capitalism found expression even in medieval love. Religious institutions sometimes formally prohibited clergy from facilitating romantic communication. issuing stern pronouncements about the impropriety of priests acting as love messengers. These prohibitions were universally ignored by everyone, including often the bishops issuing them, who might simultaneously condemn the practice in public while relying on their own chaplains to carry messages to their own mistresses. The disconnect between official morality and actual behaviour was so normalised that pointing it out would have seemed naive rather than insightful. You're still kneeling in the chapel, and the person beside you has placed something on the prayer bench, between you a small rolled parchment, barely larger than your thumb. You don't touch it immediately, that would be too obvious. Instead, you continue your prayers for another few minutes, demonstrating appropriate devotion, giving the message carrier time to depart. Finally, you reach for your rosary, and your hand brushes across the tiny scroll, palming it in a movement practiced 100 times. The lady-in-waiting who delivered it is already gone, disappeared into the shadowed corridors where she moves like smoke, carrying secrets that could topple kingdoms or simply break hearts. You bow your head once more, offering genuine prayer this time, gratitude for the message, supplication for the courage to read it, and a quiet acknowledgement to God that you're probably going to ignore whatever good sense he might try to instill in you regarding its contents. You're standing at a window overlooking the castle gardens, watching autumn leaves spiral down from ancient oak trees, and you're pretending to admire the seasonal beauty while actually calculating timing, routes, and sight lines. Because medieval castle gardens weren't just pleasant spaces for growing herbs and vegetables, they were strategic territories in the geography of courtly love, the safest and most dangerous places for romantic encounters to unfold. The garden represented freedom and exposure simultaneously, offering both the privacy of secluded paths and the plausible deniability of innocent recreation. Learning to navigate garden protocols meant understanding when a rosebush was just a rosebush and when it was cover for something far more complicated. Castle gardens occupied liminal space between the fortress's martial exterior and its domestic interior. They were technically outdoors, subject to weather and the changing seasons, yet enclosed by walls that separated them from the wilderness beyond. This in-between quality made them perfect for romantic meetings outdoor enough to avoid the crushing surveillance of indoor chambers, yet controlled enough to maintain some semblance of propriety and safety. You could claim you were simply taking air, admiring flowers, seeking quiet contemplation, all while actually conducting a carefully orchestrated rendezvous. The layout of medieval gardens facilitated secret encounters through deliberate design. Winding paths created hidden corners where you could temporarily disappear from view. Hedges grew tall enough to obscure what happened behind them. Arbours covered in climbing roses or grapevines created natural canopies that shadowed occupants from windows above. Garden designers might not have explicitly intended to facilitate romantic intrigue, but centuries of use established which spaces offered privacy and which remained exposed. This knowledge passed between generations of courtiers like classified intelligence. Timing mattered enormously when arranging garden meetings. Immediately after morning mass, gardens were crowded with people taking constitutional walks before breakfast. Midday found them largely empty as everyone retreated from sun or rain to indoor activities. Late afternoon, as shadows lengthened and the day cooled, created another busy period. But there were golden windows, moments when guards changed shifts, when most courtiers attended specific court functions, when predictable patterns created temporary solitude. Mastering this schedule was essential for successfully accidentally encountering your beloved alone among the roses. Here's the mainstream historical fact: medieval gardens served multiple practical purposes beyond aesthetics. They grew medicinal herbs for the castle's healers, vegetables for the kitchen, flowers for religious ceremonies. Monastery gardens were particularly sophisticated. organised according to precise horticultural principles that monks studied as seriously as theology. Noble castle gardens imitated these monastic designs while adding ornamental elements, fountains, statuary, elaborate topiary that demonstrated wealth and refined taste. Walking through these spaces was meant to elevate the soul while pleasing the senses. But here's a quirky detail: most people miss. Specific flowers and plants carried symbolic meanings that courtly lovers used to communicate. Placing a red rose in a particular location might signal passionate devotion. White roses suggested pure, spiritual love. Violets meant faithfulness. Forget-me-nots were self-explanatory. Clever lovers could essentially leave botanical messages, arranging flowers in ways that appeared decorative to casual observers but carried specific meanings to those who understood the language. You'd walk through the garden reading these floral texts like encrypted letters, understanding that the mixed bouquet left on the fountain's edge was actually a multi-layered message about someone's emotional state and intentions. The garden meeting protocol required extensive preparation and carried significant risk. You couldn't simply wander into the garden at the agreed time and expect everything to work smoothly. You needed a legitimate excuse for being there. Perhaps you'd mention at breakfast that you needed fresh air to cure a headache, or you'd ask the head gardener about specific herbs for a cordial you was making. These alibis established your presence as planned and innocent rather than suspicious. Your ladies-in-waiting would accompany you initially, then conveniently need to retrieve something from indoors or attend to some other task, leaving you briefly alone at precisely the right moment. For men, the logistics were different but equally complex. A knight couldn't loiter in the garden without purpose that would immediately raise questions. So he'd arranged to inspect something related to castle defences that happened to border the garden, or he'd claim interest in the medicinal herbs for treating wounds, or he'd be passing through en route to the stables. The excuse had to be masculine appropriate while positioning him in the right place at the right time. Squires and servants would be stationed at strategic points to warn of approaching intruders, creating a security perimeter around the romantic encounter. Historians still argue whether these garden meetings typically remained chaste or regularly progressed to physical consummation. The courtly love literature emphasized spiritual devotion and restraint, suggesting most encounters involved only conversation and perhaps hand-holding. But the practical reality of secluded spaces and passionate emotions suggests that at least some couples went further. Probably the truth varied enormously. Some couples maintained strict boundaries, even in private. Others used whatever privacy they could steal for whatever intimacy the moment allowed. And most existed somewhere in the complicated middle ground of touching more than propriety permitted but less than desire demanded. The changing seasons affected garden meeting dynamics in ways modern people with climate-controlled environments might not immediately appreciate. Summer garden encounters happened in relative comfort but faced the problem of extended daylight and increased foot traffic. Winter meetings were more private as fewer people braved cold weather, but standing in a frozen garden for extended conversation risked both hypothermia and suspicious questions about why you'd voluntarily subject yourself to such discomfort unless motivated by something extraordinary. Autumn and spring offered the best compromise: pleasant enough weather to justify garden visits. Enough variability that paths might be empty or crowded unpredictably. The garden's symbolic associations enriched its romantic utility. Medieval literature and theology referenced the Garden of Eden, the enclosed garden representing virginity in the Song of Solomon, the gardener's paradise. These spiritual and literary resonances meant that garden meetings carried mythic weight beyond their practical function. Meeting your beloved among flowers and fountains positioned your romance within these archetypal narratives, You were reenacting ancient stories of love and temptation, beauty and risk. The setting itself whispered that what was happening had significance beyond the immediate moment. Sound travelled strangely in walled gardens, creating both opportunities and dangers. The echo off stone walls meant whispered conversations might carry farther than expected, requiring vigilance about volume and content of discussions. But the same acoustics meant that approaching footsteps announced themselves, providing precious seconds of warning to rearrange faces and distance before witnesses arrived. Water features fountains. Small streams created ambient noise that could mask quiet conversation, which is probably why lovers gravitating toward these features became such a cliché that it appeared in countless medieval romances. Garden architecture included features that facilitated observation from above. Tower windows and upper floor chambers overlooked garden spaces, meaning that encounters taking place below might be visible to watchers you couldn't see. Savvy courtiers mapped these sightlines meticulously, understanding which paths remained visible from which windows, which sections enjoyed genuine privacy versus merely apparent solitude. Getting caught by a casual observer glancing from a window could be as disastrous as being discovered by someone who sought you deliberately, so the geography required careful study. Some gardens featured mazes or labyrinths, complex hedge arrangements, designed for recreational puzzle solving but which incidentally created highly secluded interior spaces. These were premium locations for romantic encounters but also obvious choices, meaning they received extra scrutiny from suspicious parties. Meeting in the maze was bold to the point of reckless, unless you were confident that your conspiracy was sufficiently tight that no hostile observers would think to check there. Alternatively, the obviousness could work as reverse psychology. Surely no one conducting an illicit affair would be foolish enough to use such an obvious location, so maybe it was actually safe. The role of gardeners and outdoor servants created another layer of complication. These people worked the gardens daily, understood their rhythms and regular visitors, and noticed unusual patterns. A skilled head gardener knew exactly who visited when and for what purposes. This knowledge made them either dangerous threats or valuable allies, depending on their loyalties and discretion. Smart nobles cultivated good relationships with garden staff through generosity and respect, essentially buying their silence or at least their benign indifference to irregularities in visitor patterns. Here's something that reveals medieval people's romantic creativity. Some couples developed elaborate signalling systems using garden features. A particular statue turned slightly to face a different direction might indicate readiness for a meeting. Flowers arranged in specific patterns on the fountain's edge could communicate safe versus dangerous timing. A ribbon tied to a specific tree branch meant proceed, while its absence meant abort. These systems required initial coordination but then allowed for rapid, wordless communication that could adjust to changing circumstances without requiring risky, direct message exchanges. The weather itself became part of the romantic equation. Rain cleared gardens of casual visitors, creating privacy, but made extended outdoor encounters uncomfortable and raised questions about why you'd remain outside in unpleasant conditions. Fog was perfect. It obscured vision while muffling sound, creating islands of privacy within the larger garden space. Snow was tricky because it recorded footprints, creating a literal trail of evidence showing exactly where you'd walked and how long you'd lingered in particular spots. Observant investigators could read these traces like text, reconstructing encounters from the physical evidence left behind. Garden meetings carried an undertone of danger that wasn't purely social or reputational. Gardens bordered castle walls, which meant proximity to less controlled spaces beyond. There were documented incidents of kidnappings, assaults, even murders occurring in castle gardens when lovers' quarrels turned violent, or when romantic rivals decided to settle conflicts physically. The same seclusion that made gardens perfect for tender meetings also made them vulnerable locations where the normal protective structures of public space and witness presence didn't fully apply. The end of a garden meeting required as much choreography as its beginning. You couldn't both emerge from the same garden path at the same time, heading in the same direction. That would be too obvious. Instead, one person would leave first, wait a careful interval, then the second would depart along a different route. Or you'd separate within the garden itself, each exiting through different gates. Perhaps one pausing to actually examine plants or speak with the gardener so that if anyone asked. There was a legitimate activity to report beyond the true purpose of the visit. You're walking now along a gravel path between beds of autumn asters and late-blooming roses, your lady-in-waiting having conveniently remembered an urgent errand precisely 3 minutes ago. The garden feels empty. You know it's not. There are at least 2 servants working near the herb garden, possibly a guard on the western wall, certainly eyes from various windows above. But here, in this small grove of fruit trees whose branches hang heavy with unpicked apples, there's a pocket of relative solitude. You hear footsteps on gravel approaching from the direction of the stables, measured and careful, neither rushed nor casual. Your pulse quickens. You keep your eyes on a particularly vibrant climbing rose, pretending to examine its blooms with deep botanical interest, while every nerve in your body attunes itself to the presence that's about to round the corner and enter your carefully orchestrated accidental encounter in the October afternoon light. You're holding a small object in your palm, perhaps a jewelled brooch, maybe an embroidered handkerchief, possibly a leather-bound book of prayers, and you're acutely aware that this item is not simply what it appears to be. It's a statement, a question, a declaration encoded in material form. Medieval gift-giving was never innocent, never simple, and absolutely never accidental. Every present exchanged between members of the court carried layers of meaning that everyone present could decode like reading text. The type of gift, its value, the timing of its presentation, the manner of its delivery, even the way you accepted or refused it, all of these details communicated precise intentions and responses in the elaborate language of courtly love. Learning to speak this language fluently could elevate your status, advance your romantic prospects, and navigate dangerous social waters. Getting it wrong could humiliate you, insult powerful people, or destroy carefully cultivated relationships. The fundamental rule of courtly gift-giving was that nothing was ever just a gift. Every object that changed hands between potential lovers functioned as communication in an ongoing dialogue. A knight presenting a lady with a book of poetry wasn't simply sharing literature. He was demonstrating his education, his refinement, his ability to appreciate beauty. More importantly, the specific poems included in that book would be scrutinized for meaning. Did they emphasize spiritual love or physical passion? Did they portray ladies as cruel or merciful? The selection revealed his understanding of the relationship and his hopes for its trajectory. You'd receive that book and understand you're expected to read not just the poems, but the meta-message embedded in their curation. The value of a gift created its own complex calculus. Too cheap, and you'd insult the recipient by suggesting they weren't worth genuine investment. Too expensive, and you'd create uncomfortable obligation or suggest inappropriately serious intentions that might frighten the recipient or anger their family. The perfect gift balanced generosity with appropriateness, demonstrating that you understood both the recipient's worth and the relationship's current status. A simple silver ring was a nice gesture, A gold ring set with rubies was a marriage proposal or a scandal waiting to happen. Depending on context, misjudging this balance could destroy months of careful courtship in a single miscalculated moment. Here's the mainstream historical fact: medieval gift exchange operated within broader systems of patronage and obligation that structured all aristocratic relationships. Lords gave gifts to vassals, vassals to lords, allies to allies, all creating webs of mutual debt and loyalty. Romantic gifts existed within this larger framework, which meant they carried economic and political weight beyond their emotional content. A gift from a powerful nobleman to a lady wasn't just romantic overture, it could represent political alliance between families, patronage extending to her relatives, or strategic positioning for future negotiations. Everything was always about multiple things simultaneously. But here's a quirky detail that reveals medieval ingenuity. Some gifts contained hidden compartments or features that allowed for secret messages. A locket might contain not just a miniature portrait, but also a tiny folded note. A prayer book's binding could conceal a love letter. A jewelled casket might have a false bottom where additional items were hidden. These were the medieval equivalent of encrypted communications, gifts that functioned on multiple levels, an innocent surface presentation for public consumption and a private, intimate message for the recipient alone. You'd receive such an item. Thank the giver publicly for the lovely prayer book. Then later in private discover the passionate letter concealed within its pages. The timing of gift presentation was as important as the gift itself. Presenting a gift on a saint's feast day was acceptable. Religious occasions provided cover for generosity. New Year's celebrations, the 12 days of Christmas. These were traditional gift-giving periods when presents could be exchanged with less scrutiny. But a gift presented on an ordinary Tuesday with no special occasion to justify it, that demanded explanation and invited gossip. The absence of a plausible excuse made the gift's romantic motivation nakedly obvious, which might be the point if you were ready to make intentions public, but was disastrous if you weren't. The manner of presentation created additional layers of meaning. A gift delivered through a servant was more discreet but less personally meaningful. A gift presented directly, face to face, carried more weight but also more risk. The ideal often involved a middle path. The knight would bring the gift personally, but present it in a semi-public context where witnesses could attest to the propriety of the exchange, while the item itself communicated private messages. Perhaps after a feast, in the great hall with others present but not immediately adjacent, he'd offer a small wrapped package with careful words. "My lady, I encountered this volume at the monastery and thought its verses might please you." Innocent enough for observers, but the content of those verses would tell a different story. Historians still argue whether the elaborate gift symbolism was genuinely understood by everyone or whether medieval people themselves sometimes struggled to decode messages. Some scholars suggest that contemporary treatises on courtly behaviour indicate that the codes were well established and universally known. Others point to evidence of misunderstandings, gifts interpreted differently than intended, relationships sabotaged by symbolic failures. Probably both were true. Experienced courtiers navigated the system fluently while younger or less sophisticated participants stumbled through, learning painful lessons about how a carnation meant something entirely different from a rose. Specific types of gifts carried established meanings that functioned almost like vocabulary. Books suggested intellectual connection and shared refinement. Jewellery was more intimate, touching the body, carried close, visible to others. Clothing items, particularly gloves, belts, or decorative sleeves, were intensely personal because they contacted skin and carried the wearer's scent. Religious items like rosaries or reliquaries positioned the relationship as spiritually elevating. Musical instruments or sheet music suggested shared artistic interests. Animals, particularly hunting birds or fine horses, demonstrated both wealth and understanding of the recipient's interests. The language of flowers predated Victorian symbolism by centuries, though medieval versions were somewhat different. Red roses signified passionate love that much remained constant across eras. White roses meant purity and spiritual devotion. Violets suggested faithfulness and humility. Lilies are associated with the Virgin Mary and implied reverence for the lady's virtue. But here's where it got complex. The condition and presentation of the flowers mattered too. Fresh flowers meant current, living feelings. Dried flowers pressed in a book suggested enduring devotion that transcended time. A single perfect bloom was more meaningful than a careless armful. Attention to detail in flower selection revealed how seriously you took the relationship. Food gifts occupied a peculiar category because they were consumable, temporary, and often shared. A knight presenting a lady with fine wine, imported fruits, or exotic spices was offering sensory pleasure, but also something that would disappear, leaving no permanent evidence. This made food gifts simultaneously safer, no lasting physical reminder of the exchange, and more urgent, emphasizing the immediate physical, appetitive aspects of attraction. Some moralists worried that food gifts were more dangerous precisely because they engaged bodily pleasure too directly, making spiritual love harder to maintain as the primary focus. Embroidered items carried special significance because they represented time and skill invested personally by the giver. A lady who embroidered a silk favour for a knight wasn't just handing him a scrap of fabric, she was giving him hours of her labour, the work of her hands, something she'd created while thinking of him. Knights who commissioned elaborate embroidered items from professional embroiderers didn't get quite the same credit, but showing good taste in design and quality still demonstrated attention and investment. The handwork visible in embroidery literally showed how much care had been devoted to the gift's creation. The acceptance of a gift was itself a communication requiring careful choreography. You couldn't snatch eagerly at a present that showed unseemly enthusiasm and lack of refinement, but refusing a gift was a serious insult unless done with extraordinary tact. The proper response involved hesitation that demonstrated humility, gracious words emphasizing your unworthiness, eventual acceptance that framed the gift as honoring the giver's generosity rather than your own merits. Sir, you honour me far beyond my deserving with such a thoughtful present. Your kindness shames my unworthiness, but I cannot refuse such generosity without insulting your noble intentions. Translation: yes, I accept, and I understand what you're actually saying with this gift. Refusing a gift required even more delicate handling. The refusal had to make clear that you rejected the gift's implications without insulting the giver's character or taste. You might redirect to appropriateness. Such a fine jewel deserves to grace a lady of higher standing than myself. Perhaps your sister would better appreciate its beauty or cite religious devotion. I've recently vowed to accept no personal adornments, dedicating myself to spiritual simplicity. Or invoke family oversight. My father has instructed me to accept no gifts beyond those he specifically approves, and I dare not displease him. Each of these refusals protected the giver's dignity, while firmly establishing boundaries. Reciprocal gift-giving created its own complicated dynamics. If a knight gave you something, were you obligated to give something in return? The answer depended on what you wanted to communicate. Reciprocating signalled acceptance and interest, establishing equilibrium in the relationship. But not reciprocating could mean several things: that you didn't wish to encourage further attention, that the gift was inappropriate and you wanted to minimize it, or conversely, that his gift was so generous that attempting to match it would be presumptuous. The silence created by non-reciprocation required interpretation, and different people might read it differently, creating opportunities for misunderstanding. Gift cycles could extend over months or years, each present building on previous exchanges. The relationship's evolution tracked through the objects that accumulated. A lady might keep these tokens in a private casket, reviewing them like a diary of the courtship's progression, the first small favour, the book of poems that arrived after he'd worn her colours at a tournament, the ring he'd presented after she'd agreed to a garden meeting. These material archives of romance were simultaneously precious and dangerous because they provided physical evidence of relationships that officially didn't exist or weren't supposed to progress beyond spiritual admiration. Here's something that reveals both medieval practicality and romance. Some gifts were specifically designed to be useful. A beautiful illuminated prayer book wasn't just symbolic, you'd actually use it for daily devotions, meaning the giver would occupy your thoughts during your most spiritually focused moments. A fine riding glove would be worn during hunts, meaning you'd literally hold his gift while pursuing your quarries. Practical gifts integrated the giver into the recipient's daily life in ways purely decorative items couldn't, creating ongoing reminders of the relationship threaded through ordinary activities. Public display of received gifts sent messages to the entire court. Wearing jewellery given by a particular knight announced your favour toward him. Conspicuously reading a book he'd given you signalled ongoing interest. But not wearing or displaying gifts was equally communicative. It suggested the relationship had cooled, that you'd rejected him, or that you were trying to maintain discretion. Others watched to see which gifts appeared publicly and which remained private, reading these choices like text, updating their understanding of who was courting whom and with what success. The economics of gift-giving could become genuinely burdensome for knights of modest means trying to court high-status ladies. Competing with wealthier rivals meant potentially bankrupting yourself buying presents you couldn't afford. Trying to demonstrate devotion through material generosity your finances couldn't sustain. Some knights went into significant debt maintaining the gift-giving expectations of courtly love, treating it as investment in social climbing or genuine passion despite the financial strain. Moneylenders understood this dynamic and apparently made loans specifically for courtship expenses, adding another layer of calculation to supposedly spontaneous romantic gestures. You're still holding that object in your palm, turning it slowly, examining how the candlelight catches on its surface. It arrived this morning, wrapped in silk, delivered by a trusted servant with no accompanying message because the item itself is the message. It's a small gold locket containing a miniature portrait but not of the giver. Instead, it's a rendering of a mythological scene. Pyramus and Thisbe separated by a wall, reaching toward each other. You understand immediately he's saying the obstacles separate you, that your connection transcends them, that he sees your relationship within the tradition of tragic, transcendent loves. You close your fingers around the locket, feeling its weight, knowing that by keeping it rather than returning it, by eventually wearing it on a chain beneath your gown where no one else can see it, you're answering his unspoken question with your own silent affirmation. You're standing at your chamber window as twilight deepens into night, and you're acutely aware that this architectural feature, this simple opening in stone, has transformed from practical ventilation into communication device, stage, and risk. Medieval castle windows weren't the sealed, insulated barriers we know today. They were openings to the world, often covered only by wooden shutters or occasionally expensive glass, and they turned bedchambers into semi-public spaces where sound travelled freely and determined lovers could conduct elaborate nighttime rituals. The balcony and window became focal points for some of courtly love's most romantic and most dangerous practices: serenading, signalling, and the delicate dance of communication across vertical space that separated lovers by stone walls and social conventions. The architecture of medieval castles created specific window hierarchies that everyone understood. Ground floor windows were accessible but also visible to guards, servants, anyone passing by. They offered no privacy and considerable danger. Upper floor windows, particularly those in ladies' chambers, were more secure from casual intrusion, but created the logistical challenge of vertical distance. How do you conduct a conversation with someone 3 stories above you without shouting loud enough to wake the entire castle? Medieval lovers developed sophisticated solutions to this engineering problem, turning architectural necessity into romantic opportunity. Serenading was perhaps the most celebrated window-based courtly ritual, immortalized in countless poems and songs. Though the reality was more complicated than literature suggested, a knight couldn't simply station himself beneath a lady's window and belt out love songs at full volume that would disturb the entire household and likely get him arrested or worse. Instead, serenades happened through careful coordination during specific times when household rhythms provided cover, and often with musical choices designed to carry meaning without requiring excessive volume. A lute's soft strumming could float upward to an open window without necessarily broadcasting to every nearby chamber. A quietly sung ballad whose lyrics contained coded messages could communicate elaborate sentiments to the intended recipient, while remaining ambiguous enough to avoid scandal if overheard. The timing of window communications followed patterns dictated by castle routines. After the household settled for the night, but before everyone actually fell asleep, there was a window of opportunity perhaps between compline prayers and midnight, when a figure in the courtyard below might reasonably be explained as a guard making rounds or a servant on late errand. Later night meetings were more private, but also more suspicious if discovered. Dawn offered another brief window before the castle fully woke and activity began. These liminal times between official activities created spaces where window communications could occur with some plausible deniability. Here's the mainstream historical fact: medieval music served countless functions beyond entertainment, including complex social signalling. Troubadours and minstrels composed songs specifically designed to encode romantic messages in poetic language that provided plausible deniability. A song ostensibly about a knight's devotion to the Virgin Mary might actually describe his feelings for a very earthly lady, with listeners who understood the code recognizing the true meaning while casual observers heard only pious verse. This dual-layer communication allowed dangerous sentiments to circulate relatively safely, protected by ambiguity and artistic license. But here's a quirky detail that reveals medieval ingenuity. Some castles developed elaborate window signalling systems, using objects placed on sills or specific shutter positions. A candle in the window might mean safe to approach. Shutters opened completely versus partially closed communicated different messages. A particular tapestry visible through the window indicated availability or warning. These systems required prior arrangement, but allowed for rapid, wordless communication that could adapt to changing circumstances. A lady detecting her husband's unexpected approach could change a signal instantly, aborting a planned meeting before her suitor even reached the courtyard below. The acoustics of castle courtyards created both opportunities and hazards for window-based communication. Stone walls reflected and amplified sound, in ways that could carry a whisper farther than expected or create confusing echoes that obscured meaning. Lovers learned to position themselves strategically, using architectural features to direct sound toward intended recipients while minimizing broadcast to other windows. A knight standing near a particular corner might find his voice carried upward to one window while remaining inaudible to the guard tower. This acoustic engineering was learned through trial and error, with unsuccessful experiments potentially exposing relationships or at minimum creating embarrassing situations. Historians still argue whether window serenading was genuinely common practice or primarily a literary convention that rarely occurred in reality. Skeptics point out that the practical difficulties and risks would have made it rare. Romantics cite documented instances, legal records of complaints about nighttime disturbances, and the ubiquity of the trope across multiple cultures and time periods. Probably the truth involved variation in some castles with particular architectural layouts and tolerant leadership. Window serenading was relatively common. In more strictly controlled environments, it remained fantasy more than practice. And certainly, literature exaggerated the frequency and ease of something that in reality required elaborate planning and considerable courage. The visual signalling through windows operated on multiple levels simultaneously. The obvious level involved deliberate signals lights, objects, specific arrangements meant to communicate. But passive observation also mattered enormously. A lady visible at her window during certain hours sent messages about availability and interest. A knight who regularly appeared in the courtyard at specific times, ostensibly for legitimate reasons, but consistently positioned where he could see particular windows, communicated his devotion through presence and attention. These unspoken, persistent patterns created their own dialogue conducted through repeated positioning and careful observation. The balcony, when castles had them, was the premium location for window-based romance. A proper balcony allowed the lady to step outside her chamber while remaining elevated and theoretically protected, creating a stage for interaction that was more public than a window, but still separated from ground-level activities. Romeo and Juliet made this famous centuries later, but medieval lovers understood the dynamic well before Shakespeare. The vertical separation created romantic tension, the visible yet untouchable quality that defined courtly love's essential frustration. You could see each other, perhaps even touch hands if both reached, but the architecture itself enforced separation that mirrored social barriers. Physical objects passed between window and ground through various mechanisms. The classic image of letting down a rope of tied sheets or hair appears in literature. Though the practicality was questionable, hair wasn't actually strong enough for climbing, and sheet ropes required more advanced preparation and physical strength than casual references suggested. More commonly, items were passed using baskets lowered on cords, or simply tossed. A lady might drop a handkerchief or token that her suitor would retrieve from below. The risk was that items could miss their target, land in puddles, or be found by wrong parties, adding elements of comedy and disaster to romantic gestures. Night climbing, actual physical scaling of castle walls to reach a lady's window appears frequently in romance literature, but must have been extraordinarily rare in practice, because it combined enormous physical danger with social risk. Castle walls weren't smooth, which made them theoretically climbable, but they were also high, often slick with moisture, and patrolled by guards whose job included watching for exactly this type of infiltration. A knight caught climbing toward a lady's window faced not just social scandal, but potential execution for castle infiltration. The few documented cases suggest that when it did happen, it required inside help, detailed planning, and either desperation or reckless courage bordering on stupidity. The privacy paradox of window communications was that they were simultaneously more and less private than indoor meetings. more private because you weren't actually in the same room, couldn't be accused of physical impropriety, and maintained architectural separation. Less private because sound carried, witnesses could observe from multiple angles, and the outdoor nature of the communication meant less control over who might stumble upon or overhear the interaction. This paradox meant that window meetings traded one set of risks for another rather than eliminating danger entirely. Seasonal variations dramatically affected window-based romance. Summer windows could remain open, facilitating communication but also making conversations more audible to others whose windows were similarly open. Winter closed windows, requiring either uncomfortable cold for the lady who opened shutters to participate or abandoning window communication entirely until warmer weather. Rain complicated matters. It provided acoustic cover, but made standing in courtyards miserable and suspicious. Snow was beautiful, but recorded footprints that revealed exactly where someone had stood and for how long. Each season demanded different tactics and offered different opportunities. Tapestries and curtains inside chambers created an additional layer of visual communication. A specific tapestry hung over a window might signal particular meanings. Drawing curtains indicated the chamber was occupied and the lady available for visual contact. Closed curtains suggested absence, danger, or the need for complete privacy. These textile signals operated like semaphore flags, conveying information through presence, absence, and arrangement. An observant suitor would study these patterns, learning to read his lady's daily rhythms through the textile landscape of her window. The servants who attended ladies' chambers were inevitably aware of window-based communications. Maids who helped their mistresses prepare for bed knew when windows were deliberately left open on cold nights, when specific tapestries were displayed, when their lady lingered near windows during particular hours. These women became unwilling or willing accomplices depending on their loyalty, discretion, and whether their mistress had cultivated their support through kindness, gifts, or threats. A hostile lady's maid could sabotage window communications simply by reporting unusual behaviours or closing shutters at inopportune moments. Here's something that reveals medieval people's romantic determination. Some lovers developed elaborate code systems using musical phrases. A specific melody fragment meant, "Meet me tomorrow in the garden." A different tune signalled danger, "Stay away." These musical codes required both parties to memorize associations between sounds and meanings, essentially creating an auditory language that could be deployed beneath windows while remaining incomprehensible to casual listeners who heard only pleasant music rather than encrypted messages. The sophistication of these systems suggests that at least some medieval people invested significant cognitive effort into romantic communication infrastructure. Religious music provided useful cover for window serenading. Singing hymns or devotional songs beneath a lady's window could be explained as pious practice, evening prayer, or spiritual devotion rather than romantic pursuit. Clergy occasionally sang evening prayers in courtyards, creating precedent that creative lovers could exploit. Of course, everyone probably understood that the young knight singing Ave Maria beneath Lady Catherine's specific window at the same time 3 nights running wasn't primarily motivated by Marian devotion, but the religious framing provided just enough plausible deniability to avoid direct confrontation. The emotional intensity of window communications stemmed partly from their physical constraints. Being able to see but not touch, hear but not embrace, created longing that indoor meetings might have satisfied but window encounters could only intensify. This enforced distance was simultaneously frustrating and erotically charged. The barriers themselves became part of the attraction, each impossibility making desire more acute. Medieval courtly love theorists would have approved, arguing that satisfaction killed devotion while perpetual yearning elevated the soul. You're standing at your window now. The autumn night cool against your face. and you hear it quiet lute strings from the shadowed courtyard below, playing a melody you recognize, one he taught you the meaning of weeks ago. Your pulse quickens. You glance behind you to confirm your lady-in-waiting has discreetly withdrawn to the antechamber, granting you these few minutes of nominal solitude. You lean slightly forward, just enough that your silhouette would be visible to someone looking up, and you deliberately adjust the candle on your windowsill, moving it from right to left, the signal meaning received. Understood. Proceed. The music continues, the lyrics drifting up in barely audible phrases about nightingales and longing and stars that witness what daylight must never know. You don't sing along, don't respond aloud, simply stand there in the window frame like a painting, visible and untouchable, close and impossibly far, conducting this strangest of conversations across vertical space and social chasms with nothing but position, candlelight, and the language you've invented together from necessity and desire. You're alone in a candlelit chamber with the person who occupies your every waking thought. The door is closed, no witnesses intrude, and the moment has arrived where theoretical devotion confronts physical reality. This is the razor's edge, where courtly love's elaborate rules meet human desire's insistent demands. And you're discovering that medieval romance had very specific, very strange boundaries about what could and couldn't happen when lovers finally found themselves genuinely alone. The unwritten rules governing physical intimacy in courtly love relationships were maddeningly precise and deeply contradictory, designed to permit emotional and even sensual connection, while theoretically preventing actual consummation. Whether anyone actually followed these rules is another question entirely. But understanding what was officially permitted versus absolutely forbidden reveals the complicated sexual ethics that medieval aristocrats navigated. The foundational principle was clear, in theory, if not in practice. Courtly love was supposed to remain unconsummated. The entire philosophical framework depended on desire that was acknowledged, cultivated, celebrated, but ultimately restrained. Consummation would transform the relationship from elevated spiritual devotion into ordinary adultery. Stripping away the poetic justifications and leaving only sin, the church could tolerate barely emotionally intense but physically chaste relationships. Actual sexual affairs were different territory entirely, subject to punishment both spiritual and temporal. So the official rules created a taxonomy of acceptable versus forbidden intimacies that attempted to draw precise lines in the complicated landscape of human touch. What was explicitly permitted fell into categories of increasing intimacy. Holding hands was generally acceptable, especially if done publicly during dances or while walking in gardens. This seemingly innocent contact was actually intensely meaningful in a culture where touch between men and women was normally mediated through multiple layers of fabric and social protocol. Feeling another person's skin against yours, even just palm to palm, was significant physical intimacy. Extended hand-holding in private settings was more serious but still within bounds, as long as hands remained the only contact point. Kissing occupied complicated territory. A kiss on the hand was courtly standard, expected, and carried minimal scandal. A kiss on the cheek pushed boundaries but remained technically acceptable in appropriate contexts, greeting after long absence, celebrating a particular achievement, marking special occasions. But a kiss on the mouth was different. This was intimate, personal, sexual in ways that other kisses weren't. It crossed a line that everyone recognised even if rules weren't written down. Some courtly love theorists argued that even mouth kissing remained acceptable, as long as it remained brief and didn't progress to more invasive contact. Others insisted it was already too far. The debate itself reveals how seriously medieval people thought about these gradations. Here's the mainstream historical fact: medieval theological writing spent enormous energy categorizing sins, including sins of the flesh, creating detailed taxonomies of sexual wrongdoing with different severities and penances attached. Intercourse outside marriage was clearly sinful, but kissing, embracing, impure touching, these lived in complicated grey areas where circumstances, intentions, and extent of passion all influenced moral judgment. Confessors hearing confession would ask detailed questions to determine exactly what had occurred and how to classify and penalise it appropriately. The existence of these detailed interrogation protocols suggests that the behaviours in question were common enough to require systematic theological response. But here's a quirky detail that reveals medieval attitudes. Some courtly love manuals included tests, where the lady would challenge her suitor's devotion by permitting increasing levels of physical intimacy while demanding he restrain himself before final consummation. The most famous was the test of the bed. The lady would invite her suitor to lie beside her in bed, sometimes with both partially or fully undressed, explicitly forbidding intercourse while permitting everything else. If he could restrain himself despite overwhelming temptation, this proved his spiritual devotion and self-control. If he couldn't, he'd failed the test and proven himself unworthy. These tests appeared so frequently in literature that they almost certainly reflected some actual practice, though probably less common than poems suggested. The rules permitted substantial intimacy short of penetrative sex. Embracing was generally acceptable, though prolonged embraces verged into dangerous territory. Lying together clothed or partially clothed, as in the bed test scenarios, was technically permitted as a trial of virtue, though obviously charged with enormous sexual tension. Touching through clothing-occupied grey areas, a hand on someone's clothed body was different from touching naked skin. Even intimate touching might be permitted as long as actual intercourse didn't occur. Medieval people were surprisingly sophisticated about recognizing gradations of sexual activity and assigning them different moral weights. Historians still argue whether these detailed rules about permitted intimacies were genuine behavioral guides or elaborate fictions that everyone understood weren't actually followed. The cynical view suggests that courtly love literature created elaborate theoretical frameworks that bore little relation to what actually happened when passionate people found privacy. The more optimistic interpretation holds that at least some couples genuinely attempted to navigate desire within these constrained boundaries, that the rules represented real aspirations, even if frequently violated. Probably both occurred. Some couples maintained strict boundaries, others abandoned them immediately. Most negotiated complicated middle grounds where rules were bent but not completely broken. The concept of refined loving attempted to channel sexual energy into aestheticized, controlled expressions instead of uncontrolled passion. Lovers would engage in slow, deliberate, almost ritualized intimacy, carefully orchestrated kissing, embracing with poetic declarations, touching designed to create and sustain desire rather than satisfy it. This was almost sexual behavior as performance art, where the act itself mattered less than the meaning imbued through context, language, and restraint. Whether this was genuinely satisfying or unbearably frustrating probably depended on individual temperament and how seriously participants took the philosophical framework. The practical reality was that privacy was extraordinarily rare and precious. When lovers actually found themselves alone, the pressure of that rarity combined with built-up longing must have created intense emotional and physical urgency. The elaborate rules about what was permitted served partly as guidelines, but also as negotiating frameworks. Couples would test boundaries, push limits, mutually determine how far they'd go while maintaining some connection to the courtly love framework that theoretically governed their relationship. Every couple probably calibrated differently based on desire, fear, religiosity, and practical risk assessment. The consequences of being caught in compromising positions varied enormously based on status, gender, and specific circumstances. For women, the stakes were highest. Even unconsummated intimacy discovered could destroy reputation, justify annulment of marriage, provide grounds for confinement in a convent, or trigger violence from jealous husbands or family members defending honour. For men, consequences were generally less severe but still significant social disgrace. Potential combat with the woman's male relatives, damage to political alliances. The asymmetry of risk meant women often had more invested in maintaining boundaries than their male partners. The morning after any intimate encounter, both parties faced the complicated work of reassessing what had occurred and what it meant. If boundaries had been maintained, there might be mutual congratulation on spiritual strength combined with intensified desire for next encounter. If boundaries had been violated, reactions range from guilt and recrimination to deepened commitment to mutual pleasure and pragmatic planning for concealing transgression. The emotional complexity of these reckonings appears frequently in medieval literature, lovers agonizing over what they'd done, debating whether to continue or retreat, negotiating new terms for their relationship in light of changed physical intimacy. Pregnancy was the catastrophic risk that made actual consummation infinitely more dangerous than any other intimacy. All the elaborate rules and justifications collapsed if pregnancy occurred because physical evidence would make everything undeniable. Women bore this risk disproportionately, which gave them strong practical incentive to maintain the boundaries that courtly love philosophy prescribed. Various methods of contraception existed in medieval times: herbal concoctions, physical barriers, timing based on rudimentary understanding of fertility cycles, but none were reliably effective. The safest strategy was abstinence from penetrative sex regardless of what other intimacies occurred. Some couples developed long-term relationships that maintained certain boundaries consistently over years. These were partnerships that accepted limitation as defining characteristic, finding satisfaction in what was permitted rather than constantly straining against prohibitions. They'd develop elaborate rituals of acceptable intimacy, specific forms of embrace, particular kissing patterns, intimacy routines that became familiar and cherished precisely because they were safely repeatable without risk. This approach required mutual agreement and considerable discipline, but apparently sustained some couples in stable, if unconventional, partnerships. Other relationships existed in constant tension between restraint and transgression. Couples who repeatedly approached boundaries, occasionally crossed them, then retreated in guilt before approaching again. This cycling between control and loss of control, permission and prohibition, created its own addictive dynamic. The instability was itself part of the attraction, the perpetual question of how far will we go this time, generating ongoing intensity that more stable relationships might lack. Whether this was sustainable long-term or inevitably collapsed into either full consummation or complete separation probably varied by couple. The role of alcohol in intimate encounters cannot be ignored. Medieval people drank wine and ale extensively, and shared drinking often preceded or accompanied private meetings. Alcohol reduced inhibitions, made restraint more difficult, and provided convenient excuse for boundary violations. We'd had too much wine was plausible explanation that attributed transgression to impaired judgment rather than premeditated sin. How often couples deliberately used alcohol to facilitate intimacy they officially weren't supposed to pursue is unknowable, but probably not uncommon. Here's something that reveals medieval complexity. Some theological writers acknowledged that complete abstinence might be spiritually ideal, but was practically impossible for most people. So they created graduated systems of sin and penance. You could confess intimate contact, receive appropriate penance, then theoretically return to the relationship with clean conscience, having paid your spiritual debt. This created Strangjean Juan, where sin, confession, penance, and return to sinning became almost routine, a manageable cycle rather than catastrophic rupture. Whether this represented moral flexibility or corruption of religious practice depends on your perspective. The physical spaces where intimate encounters occurred influenced what happened. A garden meeting in daylight with potential interruption encouraged restraint. A locked chamber at night removed external constraints, placing all responsibility on internal discipline. Some couples deliberately chose contexts that enforced boundaries they feared they couldn't maintain through willpower alone, meeting in semi-public locations, ensuring servants remained nearby, creating architectural and social barriers to protect themselves from their own desires. You're in that candlelit chamber now, alone with your beloved. The moment you've imagined countless times finally arrived. Their hand touches yours, fingers intertwining, and you feel your heartbeat accelerate. They lean closer, and you have to decide right now, do you maintain the boundaries that courtly love prescribes, or do you acknowledge that philosophy and desire are very different things? Their lips are inches from yours, their breath warm against your skin, and you're acutely aware that whatever happens in the next seconds will either confirm or shatter the elaborate framework of rules you've both been pretending to follow. The candle flickers, shadows dance on stone walls, and in this suspended moment between restraint and surrender, you understand exactly why medieval people needed such complicated rules, because without them, this intensity would consume everything, reduce carefully constructed social orders to ash, leave nothing but raw human need and the chaos it creates. You're seated on a raised dais in the great hall, and surrounding you is a carefully curated circle of knights, younger nobles, and courtiers who compete for your attention, your smiles, your occasional words of favour. This isn't accident or coincidence, this is the Queen's favourite system, one of medieval royal women's most sophisticated power tools, and you're wielding it with the precision of a master strategist. Queens and high-ranking noble women didn't just passively receive courtly devotion, they actively cultivated circles of devoted admirers, managed these relationships strategically, and used the resulting influence to shape court politics, protect their interests, and exercise authority in a world that formally denied them power. The unwritten rules governing how queens maintained their favourites balanced romantic attraction with political utility, personal preference with dynastic necessity, creating a complex system that was simultaneously about love and entirely about power. The Queen's favourite system operated on the fundamental principle that a powerful woman could and should maintain multiple devoted admirers simultaneously. This wasn't considered promiscuous or inappropriate, it was expected, celebrated even, as evidence of her worthiness and charisma. A queen without favourites was either failing in her social duties or suspiciously withdrawn. The trick was maintaining these relationships within acceptable bounds, while extracting maximum political and social advantage from the devotion you inspired. Each favourite represented an investment, a tool, a potential asset if managed correctly or a disaster if mishandled. The selection of favourites involved calculation that rivaled diplomatic negotiations. You couldn't simply favour the most handsome or charming knights, though personal attraction certainly played roles. You needed to balance representation from different noble families to avoid appearing factional, You required men of genuine ability who could perform useful services, not just decorative courtiers. You wanted diversity in talents. Some favourites would be warriors for tournaments, others poets for cultural events, still others skilled administrators who could handle practical tasks. Building a well-rounded circle of favourites was like assembling a political cabinet where romantic devotion replaced formal appointment. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Historical queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine, Marie de Champagne, and later figures like Anne Boleyn were famous for maintaining elaborate courts where competitions for favour drove male behaviour and court culture. These weren't just social gatherings, but sophisticated political operations where queens leveraged romantic devotion into actual power. Men competed to perform services, demonstrate loyalty, prove worthiness, all in pursuit of royal favour that might translate into lands, titles, appointments, or simply the prestige of acknowledged closeness to the throne. The queens orchestrated these competitions deliberately, using desire as political fuel. But here's a quirky detail most people miss. Some queens established formal or semi-formal rules for their favourite circles, almost like exclusive clubs with membership criteria and behavioural standards. You might require that your favourites demonstrate particular virtues: courage in battle, skill in poetry, charitable works, religious devotion. These requirements served multiple purposes. They improved the men around you. They provided objective criteria that justified your selections to critics, and they created competitive frameworks that kept favourites striving to maintain their positions rather than becoming complacent once favour was achieved. The hierarchy within the favourite circle was crucial and constantly shifting. Everyone understood that some favourites were more favoured than others, that proximity to the queen varied, that invitations to private audiences or selection for particular honours signalled relative standing. Smart queens kept this hierarchy somewhat fluid, occasionally elevating someone unexpectedly or temporarily cooling toward a current favourite to prevent anyone from feeling too secure. Insecurity kept men attentive, grateful, eager to please. Too much security bred entitlement and reduced motivation to continue earning favour they took for granted. Historians still argue whether these favourite systems genuinely empowered queens or simply created illusions of power while actual authority remained with kings and male advisors. The optimistic view holds that favourites gave queens real tools for influencing court politics, placing their allies in key positions, shaping cultural values, and exercising soft power that complemented men's hard power. The cynical interpretation suggests favourites were toys for keeping queens occupied and feeling important while men conducted actual governance. The reality probably contained both elements, varying by the particular queen's skill and her husband's willingness to share real authority versus merely symbolic influence. The relationship between the king and his wife's favourites was always delicate. Secure kings, confident in their wives' fidelity and loyalty, could view favourites as useful. They kept the queen happy, provided her with appropriate courtly entertainment, might be recruited for royal service. Insecure or jealous kings saw favourites as threats, potential lovers, or at minimum rivals for the queen's affection and attention. Queens had to navigate this carefully, ensuring their favourites didn't trigger royal jealousy while maintaining enough devotion to be useful. One strategy was deliberately including the king's own friends or allies as favourites, creating overlapping circles of loyalty that served both spouses. The sexual undertones of the favourite system were simultaneously essential and officially non-existent. The entire structure depended on romantic and erotic attraction. That's what motivated men to compete so intensely for favour. But actual sexual relationships with favourites would transform the system from acceptable, courtly behaviour into scandalous adultery, potentially triggering political crisis. So the sexuality had to be present but perpetually unrealised, acknowledged but never consummated. The engine that drove the system, but also the boundary that couldn't be crossed without destroying it. Managing multiple favourites meant becoming expert at distributing attention and favour in ways that kept everyone sufficiently satisfied without anyone feeling definitively rejected or conclusively triumphant. You'd grant each favourite specific types of attention. One might be your preferred dance partner, another your literary correspondent, a third your tournament champion. Differentiating their roles prevented direct competition while ensuring each had a valued place in your circle. It was complex emotional management requiring constant calibration and adjustment as men's needs and your own requirements evolved. The favourite system created elaborate rituals and traditions. You might hold regular salons where favourites gathered to perform for you, reciting poetry, discussing philosophy, demonstrating talents. These gatherings were simultaneously cultural events and political theatre, displaying your refinement while allowing favourites to compete for your approval before audiences that would report results throughout the court. The semi-public nature protected against scandal while generating gossip and social currency that enhanced everyone's status. Gift exchanges between queens and favourites followed their own protocols. You'd give carefully calibrated presents that rewarded specific achievements or marked particular occasions: a jewelled pin for tournament victory, a book for literary excellence, a religious relic for demonstrated piety. These gifts were public acknowledgements that conferred status, while the specific items signalled which qualities you valued. Favourites would reciprocate with gifts that demonstrated both devotion and taste, never too expensive or presumptuous, but thoughtful enough to show genuine effort. The exchange created ongoing dialogue about the relationship's nature and each party's investment in maintaining it. The retirement or dismissal of favourites required delicate handling. When a favourite aged, married, took religious orders, or simply fell from grace, ending the relationship without creating enmity or scandal took skill. You might gradually reduce invitations and attention, allowing natural distance to develop. Or you'd publicly honour their past service while making clear the special relationship had concluded, releasing them with dignity and tact. Badly handled dismissals created enemies with insider knowledge of your private world, potentially dangerous to your reputation and interests. Here's something that reveals the system's political sophistication. Queens sometimes used favourites as diplomatic intermediaries, sending them as unofficial envoys to other courts or employing them in sensitive negotiations where formal ambassadors couldn't be used. The favourite's personal devotion to the Queen ensured loyalty, while their unofficial status provided deniability if missions failed or needed to be disavowed. This turned romantic attachment into genuine political intelligence network, with favourites serving as the Queen's eyes, ears and hands in situations where she couldn't act directly. The favourite system had generational aspects too. Younger queens maintained favourites among knights and younger nobles, relationships charged with romantic potential. Older queens often shifted toward younger men who filled quasi-filial roles, still devoted, still competing for favour, but with less sexual tension and more emphasis on loyal service and political utility. This evolution allowed the system to continue functioning across a queen's life cycle, adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining its essential structure. Competition among favourites could turn vicious when not properly managed. Rivals would sabotage each other's efforts, spread rumours damaging each other's reputations, even escalate to physical violence in extreme cases. queens had to actively manage these tensions, sometimes deliberately playing favourites against each other to prevent any single one from becoming too powerful. Other times mediating disputes to prevent outright warfare within their circles. The emotional labour of managing these competitive masculine egos while maintaining your own authority and dignity was exhausting. The cultural productivity that favourite systems generated was genuinely significant. Much medieval literature, music, and art was created specifically to please queens and compete for their favour. Troubadours composed songs, poets wrote verses, artists created illuminated manuscripts, all hoping to win royal attention and favour. Queens functioned as arts patrons whose approval could make careers, and the competitive environment they cultivated drove creative innovation and excellence. The romantic structure had real cultural consequences beyond its political and social functions. Some queens developed reputations as particularly skilled or particularly disastrous managers of favourites. Successful queens balanced all the competing demands, keeping the king comfortable, maintaining favourites' devotion, avoiding scandal, extracting political utility. Failed queens let the system collapse into chaos, flagrant affairs that destroyed reputations. Favourites who grew too powerful and threatened political stability, or insufficient management that led to violent conflicts. The difference between success and failure often came down to judgment, discretion, and the subtle skills of human management that weren't taught but had to be learned through experience. The religious implications of maintaining favourites troubled some queens more than others. Devout women struggled with the system's inherent manipulation and quasi-romantic nature, feeling guilty about inspiring devotion they couldn't fully return or encouraging men toward potentially sinful attachments. Other queens compartmentalized more easily, viewing favourites as political tools distinct from spiritual concerns. Confessors had to navigate these moral complexities, neither condemning behaviour that court culture required nor endorsing practices that theology found questionable. You're on your dais again, and your current favourite approaches to present you with a new poem he's composed. You accept it graciously, read a few lines aloud in your clear voice that carries across the hall, offer praise calculated to encourage him without elevating him too far above his rivals. Behind him, you see another favourite watching with barely concealed jealousy, already planning his own gesture to reclaim your attention. To your left, the king observes this theatre with amused tolerance, understanding that your favourites serve his interests by keeping you engaged and influential among the nobility. You hold the poem delicately, this weapon disguised as art, this declaration of devotion that's really a bid for political advancement, and you smile the measured, enigmatic smile of a woman who knows exactly how many threads she's managing and precisely how much tension each can bear before it snaps. You're standing in the great hall, and you've just witnessed your beloved laughing genuinely, beautifully laughing at something another knight said. And the emotion that surges through you is so intense it's almost physically painful. Welcome to the dangerous territory of jealousy in medieval courts, where romantic rivalry was inevitable, emotional control was mandatory, and the unwritten rules governing how you displayed and managed jealous feelings could mean the difference between maintaining dignity and destroying everything you'd carefully built. Medieval courtly love didn't eliminate jealousy that would be impossible, but it created elaborate protocols for channeling, expressing, and containing jealous emotions in ways that wouldn't explode into violence, scandal, or social catastrophe. Learning these rules meant learning to feel intensely while appearing composed, to compete fiercely while maintaining courtesy, to suffer visibly enough to prove devotion, but not so dramatically that you became ridiculous. The first unwritten rule of courtly jealousy was that you couldn't eliminate rivals, so you had to coexist with them. A popular lady would have multiple suitors that was proof of her worth. A desirable knight would attract attention from various noblewomen. Demanding exclusivity was crude, possessive, and violated the courtly love principles that elevated the beloved while granting them freedom. So jealousy had to be managed within a framework that accepted rivals' existence while competing for precedence. You weren't fighting to eliminate competition, but to win within a competitive system that would continue regardless of individual outcomes. The display of jealousy followed strict guidelines. Too much jealousy made you appear insecure, weak, unworthy of the beloved's regard. No visible jealousy at all suggested you didn't care deeply enough, that your devotion was shallow performance rather than genuine feeling. The perfect jealousy was visible but controlled a slight tightening around the eyes when your rival received favour, a courteous but stiff posture when forced to interact with them. Perhaps a melancholic air that suggested suffering nobly borne. This demonstrated feeling while maintaining dignity, showing pain without losing composure. Here's the mainstream historical fact: medieval literature is obsessed with jealousy, suggesting it was recognized as an inevitable and powerful force in courtly relationships. Entire poems and stories revolve around jealous lovers, rival knights, competing ladies. Andreas Capellanus, that chaplain who wrote about courtly love rules, explicitly addressed jealousy, arguing it was necessary proof of love's authenticity. You couldn't truly love without feeling jealousy when your beloved showed attention to others. But he also insisted jealousy had to be expressed appropriately, through proper channels, without violence or excessive display. But here's a quirky detail that reveals medieval attitudes. Some courts held formalized debates or courts of love, where jealousy cases were presented and judged. A knight might formally complain that his lady had shown inappropriate favour to a rival, presenting his case before a panel of noblewomen who would rule on whether the lady had violated courtly love protocols, or whether the knight's jealousy was unjustified. These quasi-legal proceedings turned emotional disputes into entertainment and established precedents that guided behaviour. They also gave jealous parties structured outlets for grievances rather than letting resentment fester into violence. The etiquette of encountering rivals required exquisite self-control. When your romantic competitor entered a room, you acknowledged them with courtesy and nod. Perhaps a few words of greeting that demonstrated your refinement regardless of internal feelings. During conversations, you never directly disparaged rivals. That would be ungentlemanly or unladylike. Instead, you excelled so thoroughly in your own presentation that comparison would naturally favour you. You were wittier, more knowledgeable, more graceful, letting your superiority speak through demonstration rather than denigration. Historians still argue whether the courtly love-jealousy protocols actually reduced violence or simply created more sophisticated forms of conflict. Some evidence suggests that by channeling jealous competition into literary, athletic, and social contests, the system prevented some of the blood feuds that might otherwise have erupted. Other scholars point to documented cases where courtly rivalries escalated into duels, poisonings, and political plots, arguing the rules only papered over but didn't eliminate violent impulses. Probably both were true. The protocols prevented some violence while merely postponing or sophisticating other conflicts. The strategic use of jealousy as a tool was an advanced technique in the courtly love game. A lady might deliberately show favour to one suitor specifically to provoke jealousy in another, testing his devotion or motivating him to greater effort. A knight might ostentatiously court multiple ladies to demonstrate his desirability and make his preferred beloved aware she faced competition. These manipulations were risky. They could backfire if the target decided the game wasn't worth playing, but skillfully deployed jealousy could intensify relationships and clarify commitments. The different rules for men and women regarding jealousy display reflected broader medieval gender dynamics. Men were permitted more overt displays of jealous suffering, melancholic withdrawal, dramatic sighs, public poems about their pain. This was considered evidence of passionate masculine devotion. Women had to be more subtle, expressing jealousy through coolness rather than heat, through strategic withdrawal of favour rather than emotional outbursts. A lady who raged visibly about rivals would be seen as lacking proper control and refinement. Her jealousy had to be inferred from absence and temperature rather than stated directly. The tournament provided a structured outlet for jealous competition. Rivals could face each other in the lists with lances and horses, transforming romantic rivalry into martial contest. This was socially acceptable violence, controlled, rule-bound, witnessed by the entire court. A knight who defeated his rival in tournament could claim superiority without assassinating him, and the lady whose favour they competed for could watch the contest that was ostensibly about martial skill, but everyone understood was really about her. The tournament transformed private emotional conflict into public spectacle, containing danger within ritual boundaries. Managing jealousy toward the lady's husband required particularly delicate navigation. Officially, you respected the marriage, the husband had legal and religious claims that superseded your courtly devotion. But you were also competing with him for the lady's affection and attention, making him your primary rival regardless of official hierarchies. You couldn't express jealousy toward him openly without insulting the marriage itself and potentially triggering lethal consequences. So the jealousy had to remain completely internal, or expressed only in the most private, coded communications of the lady herself. The role of confidence in managing jealousy was crucial. You'd confide your jealous feelings to trusted friends for men, fellow knights or squires, for women, ladies in waiting who would provide sympathy, advice, and reality checks. These confidants kept you from making impulsive mistakes driven by jealous rage, talked you down from destructive actions, and helped you plot more sophisticated responses to rivals. They were essentially emotional support systems that prevented jealousy from overwhelming judgment. Here's something that reveals medieval emotional sophistication. Some courtly love literature distinguished between good jealousy and bad jealousy. Good jealousy motivated you to improve yourself, to become more worthy of your beloved, to strive for excellence that would naturally surpass rivals. Bad jealousy made you resentful, petty, vindictive, focused on destroying competitors rather than elevating yourself. The distinction acknowledged jealousy as inevitable while creating ethical frameworks for how to channel it productively rather than destructively. The seasonal rhythms of court life affected jealousy patterns. During major celebrations, Christmas, Easter, tournament seasons, courts swelled with visitors, creating more rivals and more opportunities for jealous incidents. The concentration of social activity intensified competition, but it also normalized rivalry when everyone was competing for attention. No single rivalry felt quite as personal or devastating. Quieter periods with fewer courtiers might see less competition, but could make existing rivalries feel more significant and consuming. Jealousy between women competing for the same knight's attention followed slightly different protocols than male rivalry. Women couldn't challenge each other to physical combat, so their competitions played out through fashion, wit, musical or literary skill, and social manoeuvring. A woman might host a superior salon, commission better poetry, wear more exquisite gowns, all to outshine her rival without directly confronting her. These competitions could be just as vicious as male rivalry, but operated through different channels that reflected gendered constraints on acceptable behaviour. The aftermath of losing a romantic competition to a rival required graceful retreat if you couldn't maintain the fight. The loser was expected to withdraw with dignity and tact, perhaps claiming other commitments, redirecting attention to other potential beloveds, or adopting the role of platonic friend, sulking indefinitely or continuing to pursue someone who'd clearly chosen another made you appear pathetic and desperate. Knowing when to concede defeat and preserve what dignity remained was essential skill in the courtly love competition. Some rivals developed strange camaraderie, bonding over their shared pursuit of the same beloved. They'd commiserate about her cruelty, compete in ways that were almost friendly, even collaborate on poems or performances dedicated to her. This transformed rivalry from hostile competition into something more like team sport, where both players wanted to elevate the game's quality even as they tried to win. Whether the beloved appreciated this development or found it irritating probably varied. But it represented one way jealousy could be channeled into relatively benign forms. The religious perspective on jealousy condemned it as sin specifically, a manifestation of envy, one of the 7 deadly sins. This created another layer of complication for devout courtly lovers who felt jealous but knew they shouldn't. Some confessed jealous feelings as sins requiring penance. Others argued that jealousy in service of love was different from envious jealousy, creating theological distinctions that let them maintain both their devotion and their conscience. The medieval mind was very good at creating categories that allowed contradictory impulses to coexist. Physical violence resulting from jealousy was supposed to be avoided, but sometimes erupted anyway. When it did, elaborate protocols existed for managing the aftermath. Challenges to duels followed formal procedures. Injured parties might demand satisfaction through combat, arbitration, or compensation. The courts generally tried to prevent jealous violence from escalating into full-scale blood feuds between families. But success varied. Some romantic rivalries literally killed people, others were contained within structures that prevented lethal outcomes, even if bruises and broken bones occasionally resulted. You're watching your beloved across the hall again, and that night is still making them laugh, and you feel the jealousy like acid in your chest. But you don't storm over, don't make a scene, don't let your face betray more than a slight aristocratic coolness. Instead, you turn to the person beside you and begin a conversation that's brilliantly witty, deliberately loud enough to carry, designed to remind everyone in the hall of your own considerable charms. You catch your beloved glancing your way once, twice, and you smile not at them, but at your conversation partner, and you see the flicker of something in your beloved's eyes that might be awareness, might be their own jealousy, might be recognition that you're playing this game exactly as it's supposed to be played. The knight they were laughing with suddenly seems less interesting. Your rival doesn't even realize they're losing, and you, suffering privately but performing perfectly, have just transformed your jealousy from weakness into strategy. You're listening to a troubadour in the great hall, his voice soaring through a ballad about a knight's devotion to an unnamed lady whose eyes outshine the morning stars, whose voice makes nightingales weep with envy, whose cruelty is more exquisite than any mercy could be. Everyone in the hall knows exactly who he's singing about. She knows. Her husband knows. but because the song never names her directly, because it cloaks specificity in poetic metaphor, because it maintains just enough ambiguity that direct accusations can't stick. It's simultaneously a public declaration of love and legally, socially, technically deniable. Welcome to the art of plausible deniability in medieval courtly love, where poetry, songs, and carefully ambiguous language allowed people to say absolutely everything while officially saying nothing at all. The genius of courtly love poetry was its double nature transparent to those in the know, obscure enough to provide cover if challenged. A poem circulating through court might reference the Rose of the Western Tower, and everyone understood this meant Lady Margaret, whose chambers were in the Western Tower, and who wore red frequently. But if her husband objected, the poet could claim he was writing allegorically about the Virgin Mary, or about an idealized fictional lady, or about beauty in general rather than any specific woman. The ambiguity was the point, creating a parallel communication system that operated openly while maintaining a thin veil of deniability. The construction of these ambiguous works required genuine literary skill. You couldn't just write "I love Lady Catherine" and expect plausible deniability. You needed layers of meaning, classical allusions, symbolic language that worked on multiple levels simultaneously. The best courtly love poetry could be read as religious devotion, philosophical meditation on beauty, political allegory, or romantic declaration depending on the reader's perspective and knowledge. This multi-layered quality made the poems intellectually respectable while serving as emotional messages to specific recipients. Here's the mainstream historical fact: troubadours and minnesingers were professional poets and musicians who made their livings creating and performing courtly love songs. They travelled between courts, carried messages encoded in verse, and served as the medieval equivalent of romantic communication infrastructure. Some were themselves nobility who composed as avocation, others were professional entertainers employed by wealthy patrons. Their work formed the foundation of European lyric poetry tradition and influenced literature for centuries afterward. The conventions they established: unrequited love, the cruel but beautiful lady, the suffering devoted knight, became templates that still influence romantic expression today. But here's a quirky detail that reveals how seriously medieval people took their poetic codes. Some courts developed extensive symbolic vocabularies where specific flowers, colours, animals, and mythological references had agreed upon meanings. A poem referencing a white falcon meant one thing, a red rose another, a silver fountain something entirely different. These weren't random symbols, but part of shared cultural literacy that allowed poets to construct elaborate messages from symbolic building blocks. If you understood the code, you could read entire narratives of romantic development, conflict, and resolution in poems that appeared to casual observers to be merely pleasant nature imagery. The acrostic poem is perhaps the most obvious encoding technique, writing verses where the first letter of each line spelled out a name or message. Catherine, I adore you, could be embedded vertically while the horizontal text discussed entirely different topics. These were simultaneously blatant and deniable. Anyone looking for hidden messages would find them easily. But the poet could claim the vertical spelling was accidental coincidence, that finding significance in arbitrary letter patterns was reading too much into innocent verse. Historians still argue whether the ubiquity of ambiguous love poetry reflects that medieval people were more comfortable with ambiguity and multiplicity of meaning than modern readers, or whether they simply had no choice given social and legal constraints that made direct expression dangerous. The optimistic view suggests medieval culture valued subtlety, indirection, and interpretive complexity as intellectual virtues. The pragmatic interpretation holds that ambiguity was survival strategy. People said what they needed to say in the only ways that wouldn't get them killed or exiled. Both perspectives probably contain truth. The performance context added additional layers to poetic communication. A troubadour singing a love song might make eye contact with the intended recipient at key moments, using gaze to clarify who the ambiguous lady of the song actually was. Or they'd emphasize certain words, adjust volume on particular phrases, use physical positioning to create private communication within public performance. The same song could mean different things depending on how it was performed and who was watching closely enough to catch the subtle directional cues. The lady receiving poetically encoded messages faced her own challenges in responding. She couldn't simply announce, "Yes, that song was about me and I accept your devotion." That would destroy the plausible deniability that protected everyone. Instead, she'd respond through her own coded signals requesting the troubadour perform that specific song again, wearing colours mentioned in the poem, positioning herself prominently during performances to signal acknowledgement, or commissioning her own response poems that used the same symbolic language to continue the conversation. Entire relationships could be conducted through this poetic call and response, with direct conversation barely necessary. The role of literary patrons in facilitating these communications was significant. A powerful lady might employ troubadours specifically to compose and perform songs that advanced her romantic interests, or responded to songs from her admirers. These patronage relationships gave women particular power in shaping the literary culture around them, commissioning works that served their purposes while maintaining the fiction that they were simply supporting art for art's sake. The greatest medieval literary patrons weren't just passive consumers, but active participants in the creation of courtly love culture. Religious imagery provided especially useful cover for romantic poetry, because medieval culture was saturated with religious references that everyone understood. A poem ostensibly praising the Virgin Mary could double as declaration to an earthly woman the devotional language. The supplication, the emphasis on purity and elevation, all worked for both subjects. Some of the most erotically charged medieval poetry disguised itself as religious verse, and part of the thrill for contemporary audiences was recognizing the double meaning that clergy were officially supposed to miss but probably rarely actually did. The preservation of these poems created permanent records that were simultaneously evidence and not quite evidence. Manuscripts collected courtly love poetry, often with elegant illuminations and expensive materials, creating beautiful books that circulated among nobility. These collections immortalized specific romantic relationships, while the ambiguity provided enough cover that descendants could claim the poems were purely fictional exercises. Your great-grandfather's scandalous affair existed in poetic form that was simultaneously confession and cover-up. Truth and plausible lie. Here's something that reveals medieval humour. Some poets deliberately over-deployed the ambiguity technique, creating parody poems that were so obviously about specific people that the plausible deniability became comic. The lady whose name rhymes with Batharine and who lives in the room next to mine wasn't fooling anyone. But the exaggerated pretense of anonymity was itself the joke. Medieval audiences apparently appreciated this meta-humour, laughing at the transparent fiction while still socially maintaining it, because the game required everyone to play along. The legal implications of ambiguous poetry occasionally became serious when powerful people decided to take offence. A jealous husband might insist that a poem was about his wife and demand satisfaction from the poet. The poet's defence rested entirely on ambiguity. I was writing about an idealised fictional lady. How could I possibly have meant your wife specifically? Courts occasionally had to adjudicate these disputes, determining whether poems crossed lines from acceptable courtly verse into actionable defamation or invitation to adultery. The legal records that survive showed judges struggling with questions of interpretation and intent that still trouble literary critics today. The competitive aspect of courtly poetry created tournaments of verse where poets tried to outdo each other in praising the same lady or demonstrating superior literary skill. These competitions could be formalized events with judges and prizes, or informal ongoing rivalries where poets released new works trying to surpass previous efforts. The lady being praised became both muse and prize. Her favour the reward for poetic excellence. Some women clearly enjoyed being the subject of these competitions. Others found the attention uncomfortable or the quality of verse embarrassingly mediocre. Musical settings enhanced poems' ambiguity and memorability. A well-crafted melody made verses more memorable, helped them circulate more widely, and added emotional resonance that pure text lacked. The music could underscore or contradict textual meaning. A melancholy tune could suggest that cheerful words were ironic, while triumphant music could reframe suffering as glorious. Composers and poets collaborated to create works that communicated on multiple simultaneous channels, verbal and musical meanings interacting to produce complex effects. The translation of courtly love poetry between languages and regions created additional ambiguity layers. A poem written in Occitan might be translated into French or Italian, with translators making choices that clarified or obscured original meanings. Sometimes these translations served to sanitize controversial originals, making them safer for wider circulation. Other times, translators deliberately heightened ambiguity to protect sources from identification. The movement of poems across linguistic and cultural boundaries created telephone game effects where meanings shifted and evolved. Some poets developed personal symbolic systems that their regular audiences learned to decode. A particular poet might always reference the falcon to mean one specific lady, the rose for another. Regular listeners would build interpretive frameworks that let them understand new works in context of earlier compositions. This created insider knowledge that separated sophisticated court insiders who could follow the references from outsiders or newcomers who heard only surface meanings. The preservation of ambiguity even in death created interesting situations for inheritance and memory. When a lady or knight died, the ambiguous poems dedicated to or by them remained, their meanings increasingly uncertain as living witnesses who knew the true references disappeared. Descendants might genuinely not know whether great-grandmother was the Rose of Sharon in some famous verse, or whether that referred to someone else entirely. The ambiguity that protected during life created historical mystery after death, which was probably intentional, better to leave questions than dangerous certainties. You're listening to that troubadour still singing, and he's reached the verse where the knight declares his devotion despite knowing it can never be fulfilled, where he swears eternal service to beauty that will never grant him mercy. And the lady he's singing about, you know her. Everyone knows her, has tears visible on her cheeks. Her husband sits beside her, applauding politely, either genuinely oblivious or performing obliviousness because acknowledging the obvious would create a crisis no one wants. The troubadour concludes, bows deeply, his eyes meeting the lady's for exactly 3 heartbeats before propriety demands he look away. She places coins in the offered hat payment for entertainment, nothing more, officially. But everyone who was watching knows they've just witnessed a public declaration of love disguised as performance. A confession cloaked in metaphor, truth hiding in plain sight behind the thinnest veil of ambiguity that everyone agrees to pretend is actually opaque. You're sitting in a council chamber where maps are spread across heavy oak tables, and you're realizing that the romantic entanglement you've been carefully cultivating for months isn't just about stolen glances and secret letters anymore. It's become a piece on a much larger board where kingdoms rise and fall, where alliances form and shatter, where love and politics have become so thoroughly entangled that separating them is impossible. This is where courtly love revealed its most consequential dimension, the moment when private affection transformed into public leverage, when romance became diplomatic tool, when the personal became inescapably political. Medieval royal love was never just about hearts and feelings. It was about power, territory, succession, and the complex chess game of dynastic ambition where romantic relationships could trigger wars or forge peace. The fundamental reality was that everyone involved in courtly love at the highest levels was simultaneously a romantic actor and a political player. You weren't just a person with feelings, you were a potential alliance, a claim to territory, a connection between powerful families, a piece of human infrastructure through which resources, loyalty and power could flow. Your romantic choices, or the appearance of romantic interest, could signal political intentions to allies and enemies alike. Smart political operators weaponized romance deliberately. Less savvy players found their genuine feelings exploited by more calculating minds. The marriage market was the most obvious intersection of love and politics, though courtly love theoretically existed outside marriage. But in practice, courtly love relationships often developed into marriage negotiations, or influenced them significantly. A knight who successfully courted a lady might gain her family's support for a marriage alliance. A lady whose courtly admirers included powerful nobles could leverage that interest into a better marriage match than her family's status alone would justify. The courtly love system, which officially celebrated extramarital devotion, actually influenced marital politics constantly. Here's the mainstream historical fact: medieval royal marriages were diplomatic instruments that sealed alliances, ended wars, transferred territory, and merged family interests. The marriage of Eleanor of Aquitaine to Louis VII of France, then after annulment to Henry II of England, literally redrew the political map of Western Europe. Royal women were married strategically, often multiple times as widows or after annulments, their value lying partly in the lands and alliances they brought. Love might develop within these political marriages or might exist entirely outside them in courtly relationships. But the marriages themselves were fundamentally about power rather than affection. But here's a quirky detail that reveals political sophistication. Some noble families deliberately encouraged courtly love relationships between their daughters and powerful men specifically to create unofficial diplomatic channels. If war threatened between two kingdoms, a romantic relationship between a prince and a lady from the potential enemy's court might provide back-channel communication, a personal connection that could be leveraged for peace negotiations. These relationships were simultaneously genuine, real feelings, often developed and strategic, cultivated because of the political utility they provided beyond emotional satisfaction. The scandal potential of romantic relationships made them blackmail material and political weapons. If you could prove or convincingly allege that a rival's wife was conducting an affair, you could damage his reputation, provide grounds for annulment that would undo political alliances built through that marriage, or simply create chaos that disrupted his ability to govern effectively. Some political operators deliberately seduced rivals' wives less from genuine attraction than from cold calculation about the damage such relationships could inflict. The courtly love system that celebrated extramarital devotion thus contained its own destruction. Mechanisms, relationships that were acceptable when kept within proper bounds, became devastating when they crossed lines, or when exposure served someone's political interest. Historians still argue whether medieval people genuinely believed they could separate romantic feelings from political calculations, or whether everyone understood that the separation was fictional and romance was always already political. Some evidence suggests that people genuinely experienced courtly love relationships as distinct from political marriages and strategic alliances, that they compartmentalized effectively and felt authentic emotion in courtly contexts. Other evidence shows sophisticated operators who never forgot the political dimensions and deliberately cultivated romantic relationships for strategic advantage. Probably both modes existed, with some people more capable of compartmentalization than others. The role of royal favourites in shaping policy was significant and controversial. When a king's or queen's lover gained influence over them, that person could effectively shape political decisions, appointments, and policy despite holding no official position. Favourites who leveraged romantic access into political power became targets for resentment from established nobility and official councillors, who saw them as upstarts wielding influence they hadn't earned through proper channels. Some favourites handled this power skillfully, others overreached and triggered their own downfall. But the pattern repeated across medieval Europe: romantic access translated into political influence that formal structures couldn't contain. The succession implications of royal romances created perhaps their most consequential political dimension. Illegitimate children born from extramarital affairs could complicate succession, create rival claimants to thrones, or be legitimized and given lands that affected the balance of power between noble families. Royal lovers of lower status who bore royal children sometimes saw those children elevated to significant positions, creating new noble lines and shifting political landscapes. The personal had genealogical consequences that echoed for generations. Strategic romantic scandals could be deployed to achieve specific political aims. If you wanted to remove a political rival, arranging or alleging a compromising romantic situation could accomplish what direct political attack couldn't. Accusations of adultery gave kings grounds to execute or exile inconvenient queens and seize their lands. Rumours of improper relationships could destroy reputations and end careers. Whether the alleged romances were real or fabricated often mattered less than whether they were believable and served someone's interests. The courtly love system's acceptance of romantic intrigue made it simultaneously easier to conduct genuine affairs and easier to falsely accuse enemies of conducting them. The tournament took on additional political significance when understood as partly romantic theatre. Knights didn't just compete for ladies' favour, they demonstrated military capability to potential allies and enemies, displayed wealth through expensive armour and horses, and established reputations that affected their marriage prospects and political opportunities. Ladies granting favours weren't just engaged in romantic gestures, they were signalling alliances, elevating particular knights' status, and making political statements about which families and factions they supported. Every tournament was simultaneously sporting event, romantic theatre, and political demonstration. Religious authorities' inconsistent enforcement of rules against adultery reflected political calculations as much as theological principles. Powerful people conducting affairs might face minimal consequences, while similar behaviour by less influential individuals faced harsh punishment. The Church could leverage threats of excommunication or annulment to extract political concessions from monarchs, using their moral authority over marriage and sexuality as political tool. Kings sometimes defied church teachings when politically necessary. Other times found religion convenient justification for setting aside inconvenient wives. The religious and political dimensions of medieval marriage and romance were thoroughly entangled. Here's something that reveals the system's complexity. Some romantic relationships deliberately crossed political boundaries to create human connections that could survive or prevent military conflicts. A prince from one kingdom conducting a courtly love relationship with a lady from a rival kingdom created personal stakes in avoiding war that pure political calculation lacked. Whether these relationships actually prevented conflicts or simply added emotional complication to inevitable wars is debatable. But the attempt to use human connection as peace-building tool reflects sophisticated thinking about how personal relationships should influence political outcomes. The economic dimensions of romantic relationships were substantial. Gifts exchanged between lovers represented significant wealth transfer. Lands granted to favourites or their families could shift economic power. Dowries and marriage settlements that resulted from or were influenced by romantic connections moved enormous resources. Courtly love operated within economic systems where every relationship had financial implications that affected not just the individuals involved, but entire networks of dependents, vassals, and associated families. The generational aspect of political romance created complex situations where parents' romantic entanglements affected children's prospects. If your mother had been the king's mistress, that might elevate your status or might stigmatize you depending on circumstances. If your father had conducted a famous courtly love relationship with a powerful lady, you might inherit beneficial connections or embarrassing associations. Medieval people lived with the political consequences of their ancestors' romantic choices in ways that shaped their own opportunities and constraints. Intelligence gathering through romantic relationships was common enough that some relationships were suspected of being primarily spies rather than genuine lovers. A foreign knight courting a lady at court might be gathering intelligence about military preparations, political divisions, or succession plans. A lady encouraged to develop relationships with visitors might be serving a king by extracting information pillow talk. The line between genuine romance and strategic intelligence operation was often unclear, creating paranoia where authentic feelings were suspected of being performances hiding ulterior motives. The collapse of politically significant romantic relationships could trigger genuine crises. When Henry II's relationship with Rosamund Clifford became too public, it contributed to his conflict with his wife Eleanor of Aquitaine and their son's rebellion. When Edward II's relationship with Piers Gaveston alienated powerful barons, it led to civil war and eventually Edward's deposition and murder. These weren't just personal scandals, they were political earthquakes that reshaped kingdoms. The failure to properly manage romantic relationships' political dimensions could literally cost thrones and lives. The documentation of politically significant romances in chronicles and letters provides historical record while also showing how contemporaries understood these relationships' importance. Medieval chroniclers devoted significant attention to royal romances not just for gossip value, but because they recognized these relationships as politically consequential. The amount of ink spilled describing who loved whom reveals that medieval people understood romance as serious political subject worth careful recording and analysis. You're looking at those maps again, and you're tracing the borders that might shift if the romantic alliance you're cultivating leads to marriage. If the diplomatic back channel it provides succeeds in preventing war, or if the whole thing collapses into scandal that gives rivals excuse to attack, you're holding a love letter in your hand, but you're also holding a political document that could be shown to the king as evidence of alliance or to enemies as proof of betrayal. The person who wrote it is simultaneously the one who makes your heart race and a key piece in negotiations involving thousands of lives and vast territories. You fold the letter carefully, Place it in the locked casket where you keep similar documents that are indistinguishable from state papers, because that's exactly what they are. Love and politics have merged so completely that you've stopped being able to tell where your feelings end and your strategic calculations begin. And you suspect that's exactly how it's supposed to work, the personal as political, the romantic as instrumental, desire and dynasty so thoroughly entangled that pulling them apart would destroy both. You're standing in a windswept courtyard at dawn, watching a knight you once exchanged secret letters with being escorted to the gates, his belongings packed hurriedly onto a single horse, his face carefully neutral but his eyes carrying the weight of absolute social death. He broke the rules, not the written laws that govern treason or theft, but the unwritten codes that governed courtly love. And now he's paying the price that everyone understood existed but hoped never to face personally. This is where the romance ends and the reckoning begins, where you learn that the secret rules of medieval royal love weren't just guidelines or suggestions, but boundaries enforced with consequences that could destroy lives, end careers, shatter reputations, and occasionally spill blood. The price of breaking the courtly love code was real, immediate, and often permanent. The consequences varied enormously depending on who you were, who you'd offended, and exactly which rules you'd violated. But certain patterns emerged across medieval courts, creating a rough hierarchy of transgressions and their corresponding punishments. The fundamental principle was that the more publicly you violated the codes, the more severe the consequences. Private indiscretions that remained genuinely secret might be overlooked or handled quietly, but once scandal became public knowledge, something had to be done to restore order and reaffirm that boundaries existed and mattered. For women, the stakes were consistently higher and the consequences more devastating than for men. A noblewoman caught in genuine adultery, not theoretical courtly love, but actual consummated affair, faced potential execution. Though this was relatively rare for high-status women, more commonly she'd be locked away in a convent, forcibly taking religious vows that effectively ended her secular life. Her marriage would likely be annulled, her children's legitimacy questioned, her family's reputation damaged by association. Her property would revert to her husband or father. She'd become a cautionary tale, her name whispered as example of what happened when women forgot their place and their virtue. Men face consequences too, but with more variation and often more escape routes. A knight discovered in compromising positions with a married noblewoman might be banished from court, sent on extended military campaigns to distant borders, or pressured to join a crusade exile disguised as religious duty. His lands might be confiscated or reduced. His prospects for advantageous marriage would evaporate as families refused to ally with someone who'd proven himself unreliable and dangerous to other men's wives. His reputation would carry permanent stain, marking him as someone who couldn't control his passions or respect basic social boundaries. Here's the mainstream historical fact: medieval courts had various mechanisms for enforcing social norms without necessarily involving formal legal systems. Banishment from court was powerful punishment because it severed the social and political networks that gave nobility their power and identity. Being excluded from the king's presence, banned from tournaments, uninvited from feasts and ceremonies, this social death could be as effective as physical exile, while being entirely discretionary and reversible if the offender could rehabilitate their reputation or the political winds shifted. But here's a quirky detail that reveals how enforcement actually worked. Sometimes the harshest consequences came not from official authority, but from social ostracism orchestrated collectively by court society. Other ladies would refuse to speak to a woman who'd broken the codes too flagrantly. Knights would decline to associate with a man who'd behaved dishonourably. Servants would be less responsive. invitations would dry up. People would physically turn away when the offender entered rooms. This distributed enforcement was more flexible than formal punishment, but potentially more crushing because it demonstrated that not just authority, but the entire social world had rejected you. Dueling remained a potential consequence for men accused of dishonourable conduct in romantic matters. Though churches officially opposed it, and secular authorities tried to regulate it, if a husband discovered his wife's lover, challenge to combat might result not always to the death, but with serious injury common. These duels operated in grey legal areas, sometimes officially sanctioned as trials by combat, other times simply tolerated because preventing them would require admitting they were happening. A knight who refused a legitimate challenge faced disgrace possibly worse than losing the duel, as refusal marked him as coward. Historians still argue whether medieval people genuinely internalized the courtly love rules as moral imperatives or merely followed them pragmatically to avoid social consequences. Some evidence suggests genuine belief that violating the codes was morally wrong beyond just imprudent, that the rules reflected authentic ethical frameworks about honor, loyalty, and proper conduct. Other sources show people violating rules constantly while being careful not to get caught, suggesting purely strategic relationship to the boundaries. Probably individuals varied, with some true believers, many pragmatists, and some cynical operators who viewed rules as obstacles to work around rather than principles to honor. The rehabilitation of reputation after breaking rules was possible, but difficult and time-dependent. Extended absence from court while scandal faded from immediate memory could allow eventual return. Extraordinary service, military valor, generous patronage of the church, political skills that made you too valuable to keep excluded might earn forgiveness. Marriage to someone respectable could signal rehabilitation and provide family allies who'd advocate for your return to good standing. But some violations were permanent cuckolded husbands rarely forgave. Families whose daughters are dishonoured maintained grudges across generations, and certain scandals remained attached to names forever. The role of the king or queen in determining consequences was substantial. Monarchs could protect favourites from consequences that would destroy less favoured individuals, or could use romantic scandals as pretext to remove political enemies. This arbitrary element made enforcement unpredictable and politically charged. You might survive behaviour that destroyed someone else, or be punished harshly for infractions that others committed with impunity, depending on whether those in power found it convenient to overlook or prosecute your particular transgression at that particular moment. Financial ruin often accompanied social consequences. Legal proceedings around adultery might involve property seizure. The inability to make advantageous marriages or political alliances reduced economic prospects. Exile meant abandoning income-producing lands. The costs of attempting reputation rehabilitation gifts, bribes, patronage meant to buy goodwill could bankrupt families. Some people who broke courtly love codes and survived physically nonetheless faced permanent economic degradation that dropped them from nobility to marginal existence. The impact on children and families extended consequences beyond the individuals directly involved. Children born from affairs faced questions about legitimacy that affected inheritance rights. Siblings of disgraced nobles found their own marriage prospects damaged. Families invested enormous effort in managing scandals involving their members, sometimes succeeding in containment, other times watching helplessly as one person's romantic choices destroyed collective reputation built over generations. The family-wide consequences created powerful incentives for relatives to police each other's behaviour and intervene in romantic relationships that seemed likely to end badly. Some violators of courtly love codes became legendary, their stories told as warnings, but also with a certain admiration for the passion that drove them to risk everything. Lancelot and Guinevere's affair destroying Camelot became the archetypal story. Abelard and Heloise's tragic romance where he was castrated and she forced into a convent provided another cautionary tale. These stories circulated as entertainment but also as moral instruction, demonstrating that even the greatest love couldn't justify breaking fundamental rules and that consequences would find you regardless of the intensity of your feelings. Here's something that reveals medieval complexity. Some courts developed semi-formal mechanisms for managing rule violation short of complete destruction. A public apology or ritual humiliation might satisfy honour while allowing the offender to remain at court in reduced status. Temporary exile with clear conditions for return gave people paths to rehabilitation. Financial penalties or required charitable works could substitute for harsher punishment. These graduated responses suggest sophisticated understanding that completely destroying violators wasn't always optimal, better to reintegrate them under diminished circumstances than lose their potential contributions entirely. The double standards between men and women in punishment reflected broader medieval gender inequality. A man who seduced a married woman faced serious consequences, but a married man who kept a mistress might face minimal sanction as long as he was discreet and maintained his primary family obligations. Women were held to absolute standards of sexual propriety, while men were granted more latitude. This asymmetry was recognized and resented by some medieval women, though challenging it directly was nearly impossible given the religious and social frameworks that justified male authority. Religious consequences operated parallel to social ones. Adultery was sin requiring confession and penance regardless of secular consequences. Priest-imposed penances, prayers, fasting, pilgrimages. Charitable works meant to restore the soul's standing with God even if earthly reputation remained damaged. Some people found genuine comfort in religious frameworks that offered spiritual redemption even after social destruction. Others went through religious motions cynically, performing penance because it was required while remaining unrepentant about their choices. The geographic variation in how courts enforced rules meant that someone destroyed in one kingdom might find refuge in another. Courts had different tolerances, different power structures, different political needs that might make one location scandal another's opportunity. Some disgraced nobles essentially became political refugees, relocating to courts where their particular transgressions were viewed more leniently or where their skills and connections were valuable enough to overlook checkered pasts. This mobility provided safety valve that prevented the enforcement system from being absolutely totalizing. The documentation of consequences in legal records, chronicles, and letters provides historians with evidence of how the system actually functioned beyond its theoretical principles. We see patterns: women punished more harshly than men, powerful people escaping consequences that destroyed less protected individuals, regional variations, temporal changes as enforcement strictness waxed and waned with different monarchs and different political circumstances. The written record reveals that while rules existed and mattered, their application was filtered through power structures that made justice uneven, but not entirely arbitrary. You're still watching that knight ride away through the gates, and you're thinking about what exactly he did to merit this expulsion. Was it that he'd been too public in his devotion, that he'd actually consummated a relationship that was supposed to remain theoretical, that he'd offended someone powerful whose protection he needed, or simply that he'd been unlucky enough to get caught when others engaged in similar behaviour but maintained better discretion? You'll probably never know the full story, but the lesson is clear: the rules are real, the boundaries matter, and crossing them costs more than most people can afford to pay. You touch the locked casket in your chamber where your own potentially dangerous letters are stored, and you resolve again to be more careful, more discreet, more aware that the beautiful game you've been playing has consequences that could destroy you just as thoroughly as they've destroyed him. The courtyard empties, the gates close, and you turn back toward the great hall, where the rituals of courtly love continue, graceful and dangerous, beautiful and deadly, a dance performed on the edge of a blade where one wrong step means falling into the abyss that just swallowed someone you thought you knew. Do you remember the elaborate codes we explored at the beginning of this journey? The separation of love and marriage, the secret correspondence, the power of refusal. All of those unwritten rules existed ultimately to create a framework where desire could be expressed without destroying the social order, where romance could flourish within boundaries that prevented complete chaos. But as you've seen tonight, those boundaries were enforced not just by shame or disapproval, but by real consequences that could end lives as people knew them. The medieval world created space for courtly love precisely because it also created mechanisms to punish those who pushed too far, who mistook theoretical freedom for actual license, who forgot that even unwritten rules could be enforced with written exile orders and very real social death. The great hall is emptying now as dawn fully breaks, and you're walking slowly through corridors you've walked 1,000 times, but somehow they feel different after witnessing the price of transgression. You pass chambers where you know secret affairs are probably happening right now, where letters are being written and plans made for garden meetings and window serenades. The machinery of courtly love continues operating because most people navigate it successfully, staying within the bounds, playing by rules they learned through observation and rumour and cautionary tales. But the expelled knight's empty place at tonight's feast will remind everyone that the game has stakes, that the romance they've been treating as entertainment or emotional outlet or political tool can turn lethal when mishandled. And maybe that danger is part of the attraction, maybe knowing that you're operating in liminal space between acceptable and forbidden. That one wrong move could destroy everything is exactly what makes the stolen glances and secret messages and whispered promises feel so intensely alive. You reach your chamber, close the heavy door, and lean against it for a moment, feeling your heart beating fast, not from exertion but from the complicated awareness of everything you've risked and might still lose in pursuit of something that medieval society simultaneously celebrated and punished, encouraged and constrained, made possible and made dangerous. The castle is quiet now in the early morning, and you can hear birds beginning their dawn songs outside your window. You think about all the rules you've learned, when to refuse and when to accept, how to signal interest without creating scandal, where to meet and how to communicate, what's permitted and what's absolutely forbidden. You've become fluent in a language that didn't exist in writing but that everyone spoke, a language of gestures and gifts and careful ambiguity, of poetry that meant everything and officially meant nothing, of love that was celebrated as the highest aspiration while being simultaneously condemned as the most dangerous transgression. And you understand now, standing in the grey light of dawn, that medieval courtly love was never about making romance easier or safer. It was about making it possible at all within a world that needed strict social order, but also recognised that human hearts would never quite cooperate with purely rational arrangements. The unwritten rules didn't prevent disaster. They just created frameworks where disaster might be avoided if everyone played carefully, honoured boundaries, remembered always that the game was real and the consequences permanent. You finally move from the door to your window, looking out over the courtyard where that night departed, over the gardens where you've had your own secret meetings, over the castle walls to the lands beyond where exile means starting over, with nothing but ruined reputation and memories of what was lost. And you make the decision you've been avoiding tonight. You'll burn half the letters in that locked casket, the ones that are too explicit, too dangerous, too incriminating if ever discovered. You'll keep the ambiguous poetry, the coded messages that provide plausible deniability. You'll continue the relationship, but more carefully, with better awareness of the blade's edge you're dancing on, because the alternative, giving up entirely, retreating into purely arranged marriage and duty without even the possibility of passion, feels like a different kind of death. So you'll keep playing the game, but with renewed respect for rules you now understand were written in other people's destroyed lives, boundaries marked by consequences you've witnessed and hope never to experience personally. The sun rises fully now, golden light flooding your chamber, and somewhere in the castle a bell rings calling people to morning prayers. You'll attend, of course, kneeling beside the same people you've been conducting elaborate romantic negotiations with, all of you performing devotion to God while mentally reviewing devotions to more earthly beloveds. The contradiction doesn't bother you anymore. You've learned that medieval life was built on contradictions, on maintaining multiple truths simultaneously, on honouring rules while finding space within them for human needs that no amount of legislation or theology could eliminate. You take a deep breath, smooth your clothing, prepare to face another day in the intricate dance of courtly love where every step matters and missteps cost everything, where desire and danger are so thoroughly intertwined they've become the same thing, where the secret unwritten rules govern everything while appearing to govern nothing at all.